Arya Stark had forgotten what the wind felt like on her face. For too many days, the air of King's Landing had been a shroud of choking dust and smoke, thick with the stench of burning timber, and boiling tar, and reeking of corpses. Separated from the illusions of what once seemed a normal city, children laughing in narrow streets, vendors hawking roasted chestnuts and lemon cakes, she understood now that all of it had been a fragile veil. Death was the city's truer nature. It lurked in the cracks of the cobblestones, behind the shutters of empty stalls, and in the silence that fell after each bell tolled amid the chaos. As she slipped through the Red Keep's labyrinth of abandoned corridors, she finally felt a breeze from a high, shattered window. She drew in a lungful of fresh air, if only to remind herself there still was an outside world, where the wind did not always carry the reek of blood and char. Her ears still rang from the calamity of battle, from the screams of men who burned in dragonfire or twisted beneath falling debris, from the frantic clatter of steel on steel. But she pressed on, quiet, alert, her body coiled in readiness. Each step that carried her deeper into the keep made her remember things she both longed to bury and refused to forget. The face of her father on the day they took his head. The smell of her sister's tears as she wailed in horror. The kindly blacksmith boy she had once tried to protect. The hound sneering at her, telling her she was too little to kill anyone, then taking her to witness more death. And Gendry, whose shoulders were always so strong under the caked sweat and soot of his work. She remembered the ghostly, terrifying glimmer of the Night King's eyes. She remembered the relief when she jammed Valyrian steel into his heart. Every memory was a tapestry of sorrow and triumph, woven with the blood of her enemies, and sometimes with the blood of people she'd cared about. The hound had parted ways from her in that final mad rush into the bowels of the keep. She had watched him fight until the Red Keep's rafters began to fall, remembered how his face twisted into hatred at the sight of his brother. The Mountain. Gregor Clegane. He had always been on Arya's list, though in truth, he had felt intangible compared to the others. A monstrous shape rumored to be unstoppable. She had once thought she would let Sandor Clegane have his vengeance against his brother. Now it seemed that plan, like all of her carefully spun illusions, had been undone by the day's chaos. She had lost Sandor in the swirl of flame and dust. She hoped in some small guilty way that he had found a better end. Maybe he had killed his brother and died in the attempt. It was a savage wish, but a simpler one. It would let her walk away without having to stare into the hound's haunted eyes again, or into her own reflection in them. But fate was rarely so kind. The keep's halls were half collapsed in places, forcing Arya to slink through battered archways or scramble over broken columns. She was small enough to find ways that larger men couldn't. She pressed her back to the cold stone as she slipped past an open corridor, listening for voices, footsteps, or the heavy clank of armored boots. Her hearing had become as keen as a frightened animal's. Anxiety coiled in her belly, but it also fueled her sense of purpose. She was here on a mission she could barely name. Perhaps to help any remaining survivors of the chaos, or perhaps to chase one last name on her list. Cersei Lannister was dead. She had heard conflicting accounts, but the city was in ruin, and the keep was half collapsed. Arya suspected that particular name could now be crossed out, if it wasn't already crossed out by the rubble. In the hush of this half-demolished corridor, she heard a rasping breath echo from behind the broken remnants of a tapestry. She froze. Another breath. So staggered and gurgling, she wondered if the person was already too far gone to care about stealth. Arya crept toward the sound. Her boots made faint taps, but she could walk like a shadow when she wished. She pulled aside the tapestry and saw a figure pinned beneath a chunk of collapsed roof beam. The dust choked the air. She couldn't see his face properly in the gloom, but the rasp and the size of his body told her enough. A man, large but not impossibly so, wearing battered armor that could have once borne the Targaryen sigil. It didn't matter which side he had fought for now. He was caught in the jaws of death. Arya, uncertain even as to why, set a hand on the beam. She tried to lift it, or at least shift it, but it was heavier than she expected. The man coughed and blood spilled from his mouth. His eyes, crusted with ash, fixed on her. "Why?" he croaked. as though he himself didn't understand why she was trying to help. She couldn't answer. She only knew that somewhere inside, a small flicker of compassion survived in her, if not mercy. After a moment of straining, she realized she wasn't strong enough to move the beam. If the man would survive, it would require more than just her effort. Another strangled cough told her his chances were slim at best. Stepping back, she lowered her head. He met her gaze in the fleeting light, and there was a helpless acceptance in his eyes. She gave him a final nod, then did the only mercy she knew how to offer. It was quick. Her dagger found the base of his skull, a lethal thrust that ended his suffering in an instant. She tried not to see the gratitude in his eyes as they dulled. She tried not to let her own tears rise. She told herself it was the merciful thing. She told herself it was better that he would not burn or choke to death slowly. With a trembling breath, she turned away. This was war. This was the cost. This was the truth of what Daenerys Targaryen had wrought, or what Cersei had refused to prevent. Arya had dreamed of vengeance for so long, yet seeing all this ruin, she wondered if it was all just a swirl of unstoppable madness. She had tried so hard to kill those who deserved it, and still, the world drowned in blood. But that's when she heard a roar echo down the corridor. A roar that was distinctly human, yet carrying the rumble of a beast. Even from a distance, she recognized the voice. Deep, harsh, guttural, a bellow that rattled the stone. Gregor Clegane, the mountain. She had never heard it in this raw, unrestrained form, but there was no other monster in the world who could make a cry like that, not even wights or dragons. Her heart jumped. A flicker of reason told her to run. No one could face the mountain alone, no one mortal, at least. But her blood roared with old rage. She remembered that name on her list. The blackness in her heart that had once demanded justice for the butchered people of the Riverlands, for what the mountain had done to her brother's men, for the horror he had inflicted on innocents. Something else told her she didn't see this through. She would regret it her whole life. She thought of Sandor once more. Surely he had gone after his brother. If he was still alive, she had to help him. And if he was dead, she might avenge him. She ran toward the sound. She passed through the gloom of the corridor, through drifting dust and ashes. Another faint quake made debris fall from above. The entire keep might come down at any moment. In that moment, she almost thought it would be simpler to let the place bury them all. But the pounding of her heart compelled her onward. She emerged into a half-collapsed hall that once led to the Queen's private chambers. The gilded doors had been broken off their hinges. There was a litter of bodies in the space. Soldiers from both sides twisted in final contortions. Some had been burned, some slashed, and at least one had been turned to a broken marionette by the collapse. 2 knights in Lannister crimson lay near the far wall, their chests caved in, as if hammered by a monstrous fist. Blood pooled around them. Arya swallowed. Yes, the mountain was here. There could be no mistaking this carnage. Sandor Clegane lay on his back not far from them, pushing himself up on one elbow, breathing raggedly, face etched with rage and pain. Even from here, Arya could see blood spattered across his brow. One side of his face was so covered with dust that the burned scars looked like pale rivulets. But he was alive. She could see his chest move. Across from him, like a massive silhouette in the swirling dust, stood Gregor Clegane. His armor was blackened by flame and splashed with blood. But the hulking shape was undeniable. His helmet was gone. Arya saw his face, bloated and discolored, ravaged by Qyburn's unnatural experiments. His eyes were shot with red, the flesh around them dark as bruises. Sandor had often called him a monster. Arya realized it was no mere epithet. If this had ever been a man, it was no longer. Gregor snarled, stepping forward with a monstrous slowness, as though unstoppable. Sandor gritted his teeth and attempted to rise. She could see his leg trembling beneath him. It looked like it might be broken, or on the verge of giving way. She imagined the hound had already thrown everything he had into the fight, but Gregor stood. That was the difference between them. Sandor was mortal, worn, battered, scarred. The mountain was an abomination beyond normal pain. Arya didn't hesitate. She darted forward, silent as a shadow, circling around behind Gregor. She unsheathed the dagger at her side. It was Valyrian steel, the same she had used on the Night King. But was that magic still enough? She had her doubts. Gregor Clegane was no wight. He was something else, something more akin to a living corpse that could still swing a sword. She spared Sandor a glance. He saw her, his good eye widening in surprise, or maybe fear. "Get out!" he barked, or tried to. His voice was raw. "You don't." She ignored him, slipping around the dead bodies. Gregor's shoulders tensed. He must have heard the scuff of her steps. With a speed that belied his size, he pivoted. His eyes were wide and bloodshot, his mouth twisted in a grimace that resembled a sneer but seemed more like a perpetual spasm. For a moment, as he looked at her, Arya sensed a flicker of something behind those eyes. Recognition, or at least the faintest memory that once he might have known who she was. But the mountain was not a reasoning being. He was a force of unrelenting brutality. With a grunt that sounded more like a distorted growl, he lifted his massive sword and swung. Arya spun away, the blade slashing just past her, the wind of it whipping her hair. She was too small and quick for that to land, but the momentum alone made her reel. He swung again, and she ducked under. She dropped to the floor, sliding on the slick stone, coming within a handspan of a corpse's limp arm. The smell was awful, but she clenched her teeth and pivoted. Even with her speed, she barely escaped a blow that would have cleaved her in two. Sandor was on his feet again, though unsteadily. He must have used Gregor's distraction to gather a fragment of strength. He lunged forward with a savage cry, swinging his own sword at the mountain's back. Gregor turned with that unnatural quickness again. The clash of steel shrieked in the halls, echoing off half-collapsed pillars. The hound's blade bit into Gregor's side, but the monster either didn't feel it or didn't care. He bashed Sandor away with an armored forearm, sending him crashing into a toppled chunk of masonry. Arya heard the grunt of pain. The hound spat blood. Gregor advanced on Sandor, sword raised. Arya seized the opening and sprang forward, dagger in hand. She aimed for the gap in his armor near the back of his neck. It was a perfect strike, the kind the faceless men would have applauded, delivered with surgical precision and speed. But Gregor Clegane was no ordinary foe. As soon as the steel bit into his flesh, he jerked around, elbow raised, and slammed Arya so hard in the ribs that she felt the air tear from her lungs. She heard the crack of bone, her own. The world flipped. She hit the ground on her side, skidding through debris. Arya's vision blurred. Pain swallowed her thoughts. But she forced a gasp and clutched for the dagger. Where had it gone? She saw it on the floor, a few feet away, near the battered corpse of a Kingsguard knight. She tried to scramble to it, but her body was slow to respond, agony lancing her chest. She tasted blood in her mouth. She wondered if her lung was punctured. Before she could reach the dagger, she felt the presence of the mountain looming over her, blotting out the flickering torchlight. One foot came down on the dagger, smashing it into the stones. Arya looked up, her eyes hazy, and saw Gregor raising his monstrous sword. For the briefest second, she saw the face of the god of death, staring down at her in the shape of this abomination. But she was Arya Stark of Winterfell, and she was not done yet. Sandor roared, throwing a chunk of broken rubble at Gregor's back. It struck the plate of his armor, staggering him. The sword blow that would have cleaved Arya's skull wide missed by inches, crashing into the floor with a crack that sent sparks flying. She rolled away, ignoring the flare of agony in her ribcage. She coughed as she gasped, forcing air into her lungs. Gregor turned his monstrous gaze back to Sandor, almost annoyed by the interruption. He snarled a guttural curse, stepping away from Arya. For a heartbeat, she thought it a blessing. But no, Sandor was in no shape to take another blow. If the mountain reached him, it would be the end. Arya forced her body up. She clutched a battered short sword from one of the fallen men. It felt heavier than needle, heavier than her training swords from Bravos, but she gripped it anyway. She saw the glint of her Valyrian dagger under the mountain's iron boot. She needed that. But there was no time to retrieve it. She limped forward, ignoring the taste of blood in her mouth, and swung the short sword at Gregor's side. He twisted, letting it strike his armor. The metal rang, jarring her arms. He retaliated, sweeping out with his own blade. She ducked, and it whistled over her head, slicing off a lock of her dark hair. The fight was no dance now. It was grim, desperate survival. She had no illusions. She'd seen the mountain's might, but she had also faced death many times before. She'd looked the Night King in the eyes. She had told him, "Not today." Sandor tried to flank Gregor, but he was half-hunched, his leg nearly useless. She heard him growling, more at himself than at his brother, as if cursing his failing body. He must have known that if he fell, Arya would stand alone against a creature of unstoppable rage. Again, she feinted, the short sword aiming low. Gregor brought his blade down to parry, and Arya jerked back, spinning to the side, trying to keep his attention divided. Sandor lunged in from behind, but Gregor spun with preternatural reflexes and slammed an elbow into the hound's jaw. Arya heard the crunch. She cried out. Sandor flew back, crashing with a sickening thud. The short sword felt like lead in her hand. She tried to get behind Gregor, to find a chink in the armor. She glimpsed the place she'd stabbed him with her dagger. It oozed black blood, thick and viscous, hardly looking human. She aimed a thrust at the same spot, hoping to widen the wound. The short sword bit in an inch, maybe two, but then it lodged in the stiff leather beneath. Gregor snarled, reaching around to yank it free. That motion alone was so strong, it nearly tore the weapon from her hands. She wrenched it sideways, hoping to do more damage. She might as well have tried to slay a stone statue. Gregor pivoted and slammed his gauntleted fist into her chest. This time the blow was so punishing that she felt her entire body become weightless. She thought she might black out as she soared backward. She landed in a rattling heap against a cracked pillar. She coughed again, and the world spun. For a moment, everything was slow. She heard the thunder of falling rubble overhead. The keep was tearing itself apart. She glimpsed a swirl of dust and cinders in the air. She heard her own heart pounding. She was sure she was about to die, that Gregor would come to stomp her head or run her through. But then she heard the monstrous brute let out a furious roar, not aimed at her. He was striding toward Sandor, who managed to push himself upright despite his injuries. The hound spat blood, meeting his brother's lifeless gaze. "Come on, you fucking freak," Sandor snarled, brandishing his sword in a trembling hand. "I'll send you to the hell you deserve." Gregor responded with a savage slash, and Sandor parried. Sparks flew. Sandor stumbled, his leg giving out, but he forced himself to stay upright. Their swords locked, steel shrieking. Gregor leaned forward, using his monstrous strength to force Sandor's blade back toward him. Sandor strained, face twisted in a snarl, but he was losing. The unstoppable brute pressed him downward, inch by inch. Arya saw her dagger a few yards away, still pinned under Gregor's boot. But now his foot was no longer on it. The monstrous brother had moved in on Sandor. If she could reach it. She gritted her teeth against the pain, rolling onto her knees. Her ribs screamed. She scrabbled forward, ignoring how every movement felt like a knife twisting in her chest. The air reeked of smoke and blood. The halls echoed with the cacophony of the keep's slow collapse. She was sure any moment, the entire ceiling might come down. She reached the dagger. Valyrian steel gleamed faintly under the dusty torchlight, as if it recognized its mistress. Arya wrapped her fingers around the hilt, the metal comforting in her hand. She closed her eyes for a split second, remembering the words she'd whispered to the Night King. She had no words for the mountain, only a silent oath to end him. Behind her, Sandor let out a ragged cry. Arya whirled around, seeing Gregor slam the hound's sword aside with a brutal backhand. Sparks and blood flew. Sandor's eyes rolled, his knees buckling. Gregor seized him by the throat, lifting him as though he weighed nothing. Sandor tried to bring his sword up, but Gregor grabbed the blade with his other gauntlet. Blood or black fluid dripped down, though whether it was Gregor's or Sandor's, Arya couldn't say. With a twist, Gregor snapped the blade in half. Sandor was left with a useless shard of steel. Then Gregor's enormous fingers tightened around the hound's throat. Arya could see the cords of muscle bulging along Sandor's neck, see his face darkening as he fought for breath. Arya lunged. She sprinted forward with whatever speed she could muster, ignoring the pain. She closed the distance in a heartbeat, the dagger in her right hand. Gregor's back was partially exposed, though the black plates overlapped. She searched for a gap. The gorget that protected his neck was partially dislodged from her earlier attempt, or perhaps from the countless hits Sandor had landed. That was where she aimed. She leapt, using the broken chunk of a toppled column as a step. She soared upward, dagger extended. Gregor must have sensed her at the last moment. He twisted, releasing Sandor to bring one arm up in defense. But it was too late. Arya's momentum carried her into him. She slammed the blade home beneath his chin, right at the juncture between the helmet's rim and the breastplate's edge. The Valyrian steel sank in, meeting grisly resistance. She drove it deeper, letting out a fierce cry. It was not elegant. It was raw, savage, a final attempt at life over death. She felt the dagger scrape bone. Gregor let out a guttural roar that turned into a wet gurgle. His arms flailed, hitting her side. She almost lost her grip, but she clung to him, driving the blade deeper still. His huge gauntlet pawed at her, smashing into her shoulder. She gasped as her ribs protested. She thought he might fling her off. But she twisted the dagger, feeling the black blood surge around the hilt. She sensed something give, as if the final barrier of flesh had parted. Gregor's roar turned into a rasp. The monstrous body staggered backward. Arya let go of the dagger, knowing it was lodged in his spine or skull. She fell to the ground, landing hard on her injured side. The impact jolted her, robbing her of breath. But Gregor was stumbling, arms thrashing as if trying to reach behind him. That massive sword slipped from his grasp. A strangled gargling noise emanated from his throat. Arya rolled aside, putting distance between them as he lurched, twisting in agony. He clawed at his neck, but the plate armor blocked him from getting at the dagger. His wide, bloodshot eyes bulged. That black fluid spilled from his mouth. For a moment, Arya believed he might still come for her. But the monstrous shape sagged. He collapsed to his knees, then pitched forward onto the stone with a thunderous crash that shook the hall. Arya stared, adrenaline coursing through her so fiercely that she could hear her own heartbeat like a drum in her ears. She thought for sure he would rise again, that some unnatural force would resurrect him. But the mountain moved no more. A final spasm trembled through his body, then stillness. The air was so thick with dust that Arya's eyes watered. She coughed. She tried to stand, but her ribs howled. Instead, she crawled toward Sandor. He lay on his back, propped against a broken chunk of wall, chest heaving. Blood trickled from his mouth and nose. She could see bruises forming around his neck. His eyes, full of agony, were still open. They flicked to her. For a moment, neither spoke. She was gasping for air. Her throat raw. That, the hound croaked at last, voice trembling with something like bitter amusement, was mine to do. Arya's lips twitched, but she couldn't manage a smile. You looked like you needed help, she said. Her tone half apology, half teasing. He coughed a ragged laugh that turned into a pained wheeze. Fuck. Yo, girl. Despite the words, his eyes were not unkind. In them, she saw perhaps a sliver of respect, maybe even something like gratitude. She laid a hand on his shoulder, ignoring her body's protests. A part of her yearned to retort with some quip about how he should have done better if he wanted all the glory. But no words came. They were both drenched in the blood and ash of this dying keep. They had survived something monstrous. She coughed again. Get up, she managed. We have to go. Sandor shook his head, eyes drifting across the carnage. Where? He rasped. Everywhere's burning. We're under rubble. The Targaryen girl set the city on fire. Arya felt a weariness that went beyond bones and blood. She glanced at the body of Gregor Clegane, that hulking shape that had terrorized countless souls. He was truly dead. She could feel it, an emptiness where that monstrous presence had been. One more name crossed off her list. She wondered why she felt so little triumph. Perhaps it was because it hadn't brought the dead back to life. It never did. "We find a way out," she said. "We live." Sandor gave a soft grunt that might have been a laugh or a cry of pain. "Not sure if living's in the cards for me." Arya's eyes hardened. "Well, you can die here under a pile of stone if you like," she said. "But I'm not leaving you behind if I can help it." He chuckled again, more softly this time. "The great hero Arya Stark. Going to carry me on your back?" "Shut up," she muttered. She slid an arm behind his shoulders. It was awkward, nearly impossible. He was so damn heavy, and her ribs flared with agony. But she forced herself to help him stand. Together they stumbled, leaning on each other, the broken remains of his sword clattering to the ground. They didn't need steel now. If more foes came, they were finished anyway. They had no illusions. They just needed to keep moving. Every step was a reminder of pain. The dust and smoke made it hard to see more than a few feet ahead, and the corridors were caved in at random intervals, forcing them to navigate a twisting path through the keep's remains. The floor shook occasionally, as if foretelling another collapse. Once, they had to crawl through a gap in a shattered wall, wincing with each movement. Arya's dagger was left behind in the mountain's corpse. She didn't try to retrieve it. She'd seen men torn to pieces by trying to loot the dead in a collapsing building. Not even Valyrian steel was worth that risk. The Hound was breathing so heavily that every breath sounded like it might be his last. Finally, they reached a corridor that opened onto a collapsed courtyard. Rubble had turned it into a jigsaw puzzle of scorched beams and broken stone. Above them, the sky was red with the glow of fires. Or was it evening? Arya couldn't tell anymore. She helped Sandor over the detritus, each step perilous. He stumbled, nearly dragging them both down. "Leave me," he growled, voice weak. "I'll only slow you. You can get out on your own." Arya's throat burned, but she forced out the words. "Shut your mouth, Clegane. If I left you, I'd never hear the end of your whining in the afterlife." He huffed, not quite a laugh. They continued, each footstep a small victory. Eventually, they reached a break in the rubble wide enough to slip through into what remained of the outer ward. The stench of death and smoke assaulted them afresh. Bodies littered the ground. Lannister guardsmen, Targaryen soldiers, civilians who'd been caught in the crossfire. A young boy lay half-buried under a fallen statue, his limbs limp and caked with ash. Arya turned her gaze away, her heart heavy. This was beyond cruelty. This was a world turned inside out, a realm of horror. But they pressed on, trudging toward what might have once been a stable yard. The roof had collapsed, leaving a stretch of open ground. The swirling wind stung their eyes with cinders. Arya coughed, each spasm flaring through her fractured ribs. The Hound's arm around her shoulders felt heavier by the second. She wondered how badly he was bleeding. She felt warm wetness seeping onto her clothes from his side. Somewhere beyond the walls she heard the roar of a dragon. She tensed, expecting another sweep of dragonfire to incinerate them. But the roar faded. Maybe Daenerys had taken her beast to chase the last pockets of Lannister resistance. Or maybe she had simply grown tired of burning the city. Arya didn't know. She wasn't sure it mattered. She only cared about surviving. At the far edge of the yard, a gateway stood, partially blocked by fallen timbers. It might lead to the city streets, or to the moat. If they could squeeze through, they might stand a chance. She guided Sandor forward, doing her best to keep them upright. He muttered curses under his breath, perhaps to distract himself from the pain. She had almost reached the gate when a voice called out from the rubble. "You there?" Arya froze, mind racing. Friend or foe? She peered through the haze. A single figure emerged from behind a broken cart, clad in singed leather and carrying a spear. The colors were Targaryen black and red, though so soiled it was barely recognizable. A soldier, Arya guessed, but not a high-ranking knight. He looked ragged, exhausted and battered. As he approached, she tightened her grip on Sandor, half expecting to fight. But she had no weapons beyond a smaller dagger sheathed at her belt. Iron, nothing special. This soldier had a spear, and probably enough strength to outmatch them both in their condition. "You Targaryen or Lannister?" Arya asked, her voice cracking. It seemed a foolish question, given the insignia, but she wanted to gauge him. He spat, glancing over her and the hound. "Neither matters now," he said, voice shaking. She realized he was young, no older than Gendry had been when she first met him. Maybe younger. "The city's lost. What are you even doing here?" Arya's mouth quirked wryly. "Trying not to die." The young man's gaze landed on Sandor, noticing his battered form. Then he looked at Arya. "There's an escape route through the postern gate," he said, jerking his chin. "Beyond that, the moat's dried up. No water to cross, just rubble. If you can climb out, you might find your way to the river." "Men undersea." Sandor gave a rasping cough. "Why? Help us." The soldier's eyes flicked down. "I had a friend. Someone from the city. She's dead. The keep took her." "I couldn't help her," he said, voice thick with grief. "But maybe I can help someone else. I'm not a monster." Arya nodded slowly. This war had turned them all into something unrecognizable, but not everyone. A flicker of compassion still lived in some hearts. "Thank you," she said. He gestured toward the collapsed gateway. "Come on," he said. "Let's go. It might still cave in, so we need to be quick." "Mendemd." Arya nodded. Together, they navigated the debris. The soldier used his spear to test the footing. Sandor clung to Arya, but every so often he groaned in pain, and she could feel him trembling with the effort. Arya's own body felt on the verge of collapse. Each breath was like swallowing broken glass. But she focused on placing one foot in front of the other. They squeezed through a narrow gap in the stone, emerging into an alley behind the keep's outer walls. It was nearly deserted, though scattered corpses indicated that fleeing townsfolk had once tried to run this way. The soldier guided them toward the postern gate, a smaller archway half blocked by toppled masonry. A swirl of dust revealed a slope of rubble leading down where the moat should have been. The ground was cracked and dry, likely from the intense heat. Their silent guide turned to them, eyes hollow. "That's it," he said. "Best of luck." He looked at Arya for a moment, as if searching for something to say. Perhaps he recognized her. Perhaps he was only seeing a battered girl carrying a half-dead man. "Don't let him die here." Then, with a final nod, the soldier set off into another ruined street. Arya doubted he would survive much longer, but she had no strength to follow him. She had to get the hound out. Sandor's breathing was wheezing, blood caking his beard. They descended carefully down the slope of rubble. Each step jarred her ribs, sending spikes of pain through her torso. She bit her tongue until she tasted blood. The last thing they needed was to fall now. Sandor's leg buckled more than once, and she felt her arms straining to hold him up. But at last, they reached the bottom of the moat. It was surreal to stand there, remembering the stories of the dragon skulls that once lurked in the darkness beneath the Red Keep. The water that had guarded these walls. Now it was a crater of ash and broken stone. From there, it was a matter of climbing up the opposite side. It looked an even steeper slope, and Arya realized with a sick feeling that she couldn't do it alone while supporting Sandor. Their combined weight was too great, her injuries too severe. She swallowed, searching for an alternative route. She spotted a partial ramp formed by a collapsed portion of the outer wall. If they could edge along it, maybe they could reach higher ground. Sandor coughed violently as she maneuvered him toward it. They started up, arms and legs trembling. She pressed a hand against her side, feeling a warm gush of blood from her own wounds. She had no illusions that they would make it far. But every step was one closer to being free of the keep. When they were perhaps halfway up, Sandor's foot slipped on a loose stone. He swore, toppling backward. Arya cried out, scrambling to brace him, but they both went down, sliding a few feet, battered by jagged rubble. She felt her vision swim. Sandor let out a guttural groan. For a moment, they simply lay there, dust swirling around them, hearts pounding. Arya was almost ready to give in to let the void claim her. The pain was so overwhelming she felt nauseous, dizzy. But then she heard a faint cry. From above them, 3 ragged forms emerged. They wore tattered clothing, their faces smeared with soot. Arya realized they were common folk, 2 men and a woman. They saw Arya and Sandor sprawled on the rubble and rushed down to help, reckless or compassionate enough not to abandon them. Arya expected them to flee or scavenge, but they reached out with dirty hands, hooking under Sandor's arms. The woman knelt beside Arya. "You'll die here if you don't get up," she said, voice gentle but insistent. "Come on." Arya allowed them to help. She bit back a scream when her battered ribs rubbed against the stones. The 2 men managed to pull Sandor upright. He was nearly unconscious. Arya forced her legs to steady beneath her. With the stranger's assistance, they ascended the slope. It felt like an eternity. Her breath came in ragged sobs. But somehow, they made it over the crest of the collapsed wall. Beyond, the city sprawled in ruin. Streets were choked with rubble. Entire blocks smoldered with the aftermath of dragonfire. The stench of burning flesh hung in the air. Here and there, she saw silhouettes of survivors picking through the wreckage. A wail of anguish reached her ears from some distant block. There was no sign of an organized authority, no gold cloaks, no Targaryen army patrolling. Perhaps they too had fled or perished. The 3 strangers helped ease Sandor and Arya to a stable portion of the wall. Arya slumped against the stone, breathing hard. "Thank you," she managed, unsure if the words even sufficed. The woman, who had braided hair turned gray with ash, nodded. "I saw you from above. You look done for. Are you from the north? You look like northern folk." Arya nodded wearily. "We're trying to survive." The woman glanced at Sandor. "He needs a maester. Or someone who knows stitches, at least." Arya almost laughed, though it hurt too much. "Not many maesters left in King's Landing," she said. She closed her eyes for a moment, feeling tears gather. She wondered what Sansa would say if she saw Arya like this. Broken, battered, barely able to stand, having killed one more monstrous man. Would Sansa even believe Arya's path to get here? One of the men, a wiry fellow with a bandaged arm, pointed east. The fightings mostly died down that way. The queen, if she still is queen, was spotted near the Red Keep, but it's not but rubble now. We aim to find a way out of the city. Maybe along the Blackwater. "Done?" Arya nodded, glancing to the horizon. The wind carried embers from the many fires that had consumed King's Landing. "We'll try the same." she said, her voice quiet. The trio exchanged looks, unsure if they should travel together. But something in the battered shape of Arya and Sandor must have stirred their pity. "We'll help you get him as far as we can," the woman decided, her tone gently firm. "After that, we'll see." Arya gave a single nod of thanks. She didn't know these people's names, and maybe she never would. But she was grateful. Maybe there was hope in the hearts of ordinary folk, even amidst all this ruin. They set off through the broken streets, moving slowly. The men took most of Sandor's weight. Arya followed close by, gingerly pressing a hand to her injured ribs. She tried to remain alert, scanning for danger, but she was too exhausted to do more than keep her feet. Whenever she looked back at the Red Keep, she saw a haze of dust and smoke swirling around the jagged towers. She imagined the corpse of the mountain lying there, lifeless, her Valyrian dagger lodged in his neck. She wondered if that story would ever be told, if anyone would know how Gregor Clegane finally fell. Likely not. Perhaps that was better. She had never killed for glory. She killed so the ones she loved might have a chance to live. They passed through an abandoned market square, stepping over scattered fruit stalls. Flies buzzed around rotting produce. A charred wagon wheel still smoked where some spark must have caught it. Arya tried not to breathe too deeply, for fear of the stench and the pain. Sandor, half conscious, muttered curses now and then, sometimes calls for water. One of the men had a water skin with a few remaining gulps of tepid liquid, which he shared grudgingly. Arya managed to take a mouthful, feeling it soothe her parched throat. She almost collapsed from relief. Past the square, they found a street that had partially buckled, as if an earthquake had shaken it. Bodies were pinned under the wreckage of collapsed houses. Their newfound companions flinched at the carnage but pressed on, mindful that stopping to bury the dead would mean their own end. At last, they reached a vantage point above the river gate. The gate was shut, but part of the adjoining wall had crumbled. People milled there, no guards in sight. They looked like refugees, covered in ash and dirt, holding children or clutching sacks of meager possessions. The press of bodies suggested a possible exodus from the city. Arya's group descended a sloping alley, working their way toward the river. She knew that if they could cross the Blackwater, they might find friends or at least neutrality. The Targaryen armies had moved on after sacking the city, or so it seemed. Maybe, with luck, they could find a ship or a fisherman willing to ferry them across. If not, they might still be forced to brave the waters. As they neared the crowd, some people eyed the hound suspiciously. He was big, battered, and carried the look of a man who had once been a killer. But these were desperate times. No one wanted a fight, especially not with Arya's silent determination and the presence of the other three. They slowly made their way through. Broken bits of conversation reached Arya's ears. Fires at the sept. Everyone burned. Dragon flew overhead. Black wings. Saw the queen. She was burning them, everyone. Need to find a maester. The children are coughing. No coin for bread. It was a litany of despair. Arya forced herself not to dwell on it. She clutched Sandor's arm, guiding him away from the worst of the crush. The crowd seemed to have no leadership, just a frantic aim to get out. Some scrambled over the fallen stones in the wall. Others tried to pry open the gate. The structure was twisted and jammed. A handful of men hammered at it with axes, hoping to break it enough for passage. The woman with the braided hair exchanged a glance with the men. "We'll head around to that breach," she said, pointing to where a chunk of wall had collapsed more heavily. Less people, maybe an easier route. They followed her lead. The rubble formed a precarious ramp up and over. Some had already made the climb. Arya spotted a small group on the far side, beckoning for others to pass. They were forming a kind of chain to help the wounded and children. Heart pounding, breath ragged, Arya and the others joined the queue. When their turn came, the two men aided Sandor first, hauling him up inch by inch. He let out a growl of pain but didn't protest. Arya scrambled alongside, ignoring her own agony. They reached the top, then slid down the broken masonry on the other side. Her feet touched the ground in a swirl of dust. She almost collapsed to her knees, but forced herself to remain upright. Beyond the wall was a stretch of scorched countryside leading to the Blackwater River. Fields once green and fertile had been trampled or burned. The river glittered faintly in the dusk, though the sky remained hazy with smoke. "We got you this far," one of the men said, breathing heavily. "We'll try for the river road. Maybe find a wagon or a donkey." The woman nodded to Arya. "Good luck to you. And to him." Arya tried to find words, but only a whisper came out. "Thank you." Without further ado, the three strangers went on their way, picking their path through the rubble and bodies that dotted the outskirts. Arya stood there, supporting Sandor, who leaned heavily on her. His eyes were half closed, sweat trickling down his scarred face. "We need to find a boat," she said. The river was still a ways off, but if they could get on the water, perhaps they could slip away from the devastation. Sandor coughed. "Don't matter," he muttered. "I'm done. You, go on." "Shut up," Arya said, though softly. "Don't you want your chickens after all this?" He huffed a pained laugh. "You remember that?" "I remember everything," she said. She steadied him, and they began the slow walk across the ruined fields. Pockets of flame still burned in some places, and they picked their way around them. Occasionally, they passed someone rummaging through the wreckage for valuables or food. Arya kept her eyes ahead, determined to avoid trouble. Her body was close to its limit. She suspected Sandor's was even closer. Time blurred. Each step was a small eternity of pain. Finally, they reached the banks of the Blackwater. The water looked dark and uninviting, especially under the murky twilight sky. There, Arya spotted a small rowboat half-submerged near a makeshift dock that seemed on the verge of collapse. No one else was around. Perhaps the boat was damaged or overlooked. She guided Sandor over. Kneeling in the muddy bank made her teeth clench as her ribs screamed. The boat had a crack along one side, but maybe it could still float for a short distance. It was enough to get them across the river, or at least halfway, if the water wasn't too rough. Sandor looked at the boat with bleary eyes. "Not sure you'll get me in that without drowning." "I'll manage," she said, though in truth, she wasn't sure how. She placed a hand on his chest, feeling the slight rise and fall, the wet warmth of blood. "You're not dying here." He seemed about to protest. Then his head sagged. "Fucking stubborn girl," he murmured. But she sensed the faintest acceptance in him, a part of him that still clung to life despite all his words. Gritting her teeth, she slid the boat a little to see if it would budge. It moved, albeit with a groan of water rushing through the crack. The craft might sink. She had to be quick. She pulled it closer to the shore. Then she eased Sandor in, propping him in the middle so that the water wouldn't rush over the edge. She could see the torment on his face. Next, she grabbed one of the oars that lay half buried in the mud. The other was missing or broken. One might suffice if the current wasn't strong. She eased herself into the boat, feeling it wobble and shift. The water lapped at the edges. "Please hold," she muttered. Her chest screamed with every motion, but she began to row. The boat lurched into the current. They drifted away from the shore, leaving behind the smoldering skyline of King's Landing. Arya spared one last look at the towers. Tears blurred her vision. This city had taken so much from her. Her father, her innocence, her illusions. And yet, a part of her had come here seeking vengeance and found it, in a manner of speaking. Gregor Clegane was dead, killed by her hand. But that name on her list brought her no elation. Only a numb sorrow, mingled with a tired relief. Sandor groaned, eyes fluttering. Arya tried to row them toward the far side of the river, where the land was less scorched. Each stroke sent a jolt of pain through her battered side. She gasped, fighting the darkness creeping at the edges of her vision. The crack in the boat let water seep in, drenching her legs. If they didn't reach the bank soon, they'd sink. She rowed harder, ignoring the hot tears streaking her cheeks. She thought of her family. Sansa was somewhere, maybe in Winterfell. Jon was presumably somewhere else, maybe near Daenerys, assuming he was still alive. Bran was the king in the north or the quiet raven on the throne, depending on whose rumors she believed. She didn't know what the future held for her, or for this broken land. One more stroke, and the prow scraped against something solid. She realized with relief that they had drifted to the shallow part of the opposite bank. She breathed out a ragged sigh. Then, mustering the last of her strength, she hauled the boat up enough that Sandor wouldn't be left in the water. She stumbled out, pulling him by the arms until he could slump onto firmer ground. They lay there, the boat slowly leaking behind them. The current lapped at the hull, but at least they wouldn't drown. Arya's vision pulsed with exhaustion. She had no illusions that their ordeal was over. Sandor needed real help. She was fairly sure her ribs were broken. But for the first time, she felt a faint sense of release, a sense that they'd escaped the jaws of certain death. She turned to Sandor. His eyes were closed, his breathing shallow. She pressed a trembling hand to his neck and felt a weak pulse. He was alive, but just barely. "Don't die," she whispered, her voice hitching. "Not after all this, you stubborn dog." He didn't answer, but a faint flutter of his eyelids told her he heard. She glanced around. The land beyond the river was a patchwork of brush and farmland, mostly untouched by the fires that had ravaged the city. There might be a cottage or a small settlement further inland, where they could find help, or at least a place to rest. She dug into her belt pouch. She had almost forgotten it amidst the chaos. Inside, she still had the coin Jaqen H'ghar had given her in Bravos, the iron coin that signified the faceless men. She also found a wad of cloth that she could use as a makeshift bandage. It was pitifully small, but it was something. Slowly, she peeled back Sandor's torn clothing to see the wounds. He had a gash on his side that looked deep, seeping blood. She pressed the cloth there, applying as much pressure as she dared. He grunted and stirred, eyelids flickering. "Don't fuss," he growled weakly. Arya bit her lip. She tore another strip of cloth from her tunic to reinforce the bandage. Her own wounds needed tending too, but she had to prioritize him. She did what she could, though she had no real skill at healing. She recalled the times she'd helped the kindly man in Bravos treat his own wounds. She only hoped it was enough to stop him from bleeding out. When she'd done all she could, she collapsed beside him, both of them lying on the muddy bank. The late evening sky stretched above, tinted by the glow of distant fires. She could hear the water lapping, the faint crackle of flames, and the hush of the wind. She thought of the mountain again, that monstrous shape slumping to the ground with her dagger in his throat. The memory felt unreal. She'd grown up hearing stories of Gregor Clegane's cruelty. She had once listed his name as a vow for revenge. And now, that vow was fulfilled. But it hadn't undone the city's ruin, or the lives lost. It hadn't healed her father's death. It hadn't given her peace. Maybe vengeance was like that, a fleeting satisfaction drowned by the oceans of blood still left behind. She thought of all the names she had whispered at night, the hours she'd spent training in the dark. Now she wondered if this was what she truly wanted. Surviving with the Hound, limping away from the city's destruction, battered in body and soul. But she was still alive, and that had to mean something. Gradually, Arya forced herself to sit up. She brushed the mud from her hands and tried to stand. Her ribs flared in protest, but she clenched her teeth. She had to find shelter. She scanned the horizon, squinting through the gloom. There, in the distance, she could see a faint glow of light, perhaps a lantern or a torch. It might be a farmhouse. They had no guarantees the occupants would be friendly, but it was their only chance. She knelt by Sandor. "I'll be back," she whispered. "I'm going to find help." He opened his eyes a sliver. "Don't be stupid," he rasped. "They want help, the likes of us." She managed a ghost of a smile. "Then I'll make them." She placed a hand gently on his shoulder, feeling the heat of fever beginning to burn. "You saved me more times than I want to admit. Let me save you." His mouth twitched, but he was too weak to argue. She squeezed his shoulder, then rose unsteadily, taking a moment to gather her strength. Each step was a challenge, but she pressed on, following that distant flicker of light. As Arya trudged through the sparse brush, her mind flickered with images of her past. Needle in her hand, Sirio Forel's lessons echoing in her ears, the Hound taunting her to drive her to fight, Gendry's grin in the smithy, her mother's face the last time she saw her alive, her father's final moments. She remembered the House of Black and White, the weirwood faces in Winterfell, and the looming presence of death in the north. All those ghosts had shaped her into who she was now, a girl who had taken so many lives. But for all she had lost, something inside her refused to break. She felt it in the echo of her father's voice. The lone wolf dies, but the pack survives. Even though she had strayed far from her pack, she was still a Stark of Winterfell. She could still save those she cared about. She might never find complete peace, but she could keep going, one step at a time. The flicker of light grew brighter, and the shape of a small cottage emerged in the gloom. A single candle burned in a window, or maybe a lantern. She approached warily, aware that the inhabitants might be armed or hostile. She could barely stand, let alone fight. But she had to try. She raised a trembling fist and knocked. For a moment, there was silence. Then she heard muffled voices shuffling. The door creaked open a crack, revealing a young woman's face, lined with worry. She saw Arya, ragged, bloodied, trembling. Arya forced out the words, hoping the woman wouldn't slam the door. "My friend is hurt. We escaped the city. Please, help. Ben?" The woman stared, her eyes reflecting fear. She glanced behind her, and Arya heard a man's voice, older. After a moment, the woman opened the door wider. She stepped aside, beckoning Arya in. And Arya realized maybe there was still kindness left in the world. She exhaled, relief washing over her like a wave. She started to speak, but the ground seemed to tilt under her feet. Darkness closed in at the edges of her vision. The last thing she felt was the woman's arms catching her, keeping her from hitting the floor. She heard someone shouting for her father to help. Then everything went black. When she awoke, she was on a pallet of straw, in a small, warm space. Candlelight flickered on the walls, and she heard muffled voices. She tried to move, but the pain in her ribs made her wince. A coarse blanket lay over her. She tried to sit, but dizziness swam in her head. A gray-bearded man approached, kneeling beside her. "Easy," he said softly. "You've lost blood. Broken ribs too, I'd wager. We did what we could. You'll be weak for a while." Arya swallowed, her throat dry. "My friend," she croaked. "The big man." The older man nodded. "He's alive, though feverish. My daughter and we tried to clean his wounds. Gave him some milk of the poppy so he'd rest. He's in the other room. He's a surly one, tried to fight us off even in delirium." He offered Arya a cup of water. She took it gratefully, sipping slowly. Arya let out a breath of relief. She managed a slight nod of thanks, too exhausted for more words. The man set a hand on her shoulder. Gentle. "Rest," he said. "We won't turn you out, no matter what you've done. This war's left too many lost souls. We're decent folk, or try to be." "Men? And?" She mustered what might have been a smile. "Thank you," she whispered. Her vision already fading as the weariness claimed her. She gave in to it, letting the darkness welcome her. The days that followed passed in a blur of fever and pain. She was vaguely aware of the man changing her bandages, of the daughter spooning broth into her mouth, of hearing Sandor's gruff curses through the walls. They were kept warm, given some measure of privacy. She heard talk of King's Landing, how survivors were fleeing, how Daenerys' troops were reorganizing. She heard rumors that the Lannisters were finished, that Tyrion was a prisoner, that Jon Snow might be negotiating. She could barely keep the details straight. She simply lay there, healing. Eventually, her body began to mend. The swelling in her side subsided. She gained enough strength to sit up, to eat on her own. Each day, she tested her mobility, taking careful steps with the help of a wooden crutch the farmer fashioned for her. She asked to see Sandor, but the daughter gently told her he was still too weak for visitors. That changed after a couple of days, when the father said it was safe. She found him in a smaller room, more a closet than a chamber, lying on a pallet. He looked thinner, his face pale and drawn. But his eyes opened as she entered. He gave a low grunt. "Looks like we made it," he rasped. Arya let out a breath. "Barely." He snorted, then winced at the pain. "You killed that big bastard?" he asked, though she guessed he already knew. She nodded slowly. "He's gone. I took your kill, if that's what you want to say." Sandor stared at her for a moment, something unreadable in his expression. "I wanted to be the one," he said, voice rough. "But maybe it's better this way. I never would have walked out of that keep alive. Not if I faced him alone." Arya lowered her gaze. She remembered the savage fury in the mountain's final throes, and she knew the hound was right. Even two of them nearly weren't enough. Finally, she said, "He's dead. That's all that matters." Sandor nodded. Then a faint smirk. "Little wolf kills the big monster. That's a story the bards might sing, if they ever learn about it." She felt a flicker of bitterness. "I don't want songs," she said. "I just want—" She trailed off. She wasn't sure what she wanted. Peace? A home? The warmth of her family? She swallowed. "I just want to be free of all this." He huffed a breath. Join the fucking club. Silence fell, broken only by the distant cluck of a chicken in the yard beyond the cottage. Arya wondered if she and Sandor were bound by anything more than a shared hatred of the world's cruelty. They'd been traveling companions, enemies, reluctant allies. Now what were they? Survivors, perhaps. I don't plan on staying here forever, she said quietly. Once we can walk, I'm leaving. He raised an eyebrow. Where? I don't know, Arya admitted. North, maybe? Or west across the sea? Or maybe the farm next door, if that's all I can manage. She sighed. But I can't stay near that city. It's a graveyard now. The hound closed his eyes, looking weary. I'll not stay either, he said. The city's no place for me. Not anymore. Not ever. She studied him, remembering all the times she'd wanted to kill him, all the times she'd hated him, and all the times he'd saved her life. She nodded, pressing her lips together. We'll see what tomorrow brings then. They stayed under the farmer's roof for another week, maybe more. Arya lost track of time. Each day, she gained strength. Her ribs knit slowly, though moving still hurt. Sandor's fever broke, and he became mobile enough to shuffle around the cottage, leaning on the walls. The farmer and his daughter had reservations about them lingering, but the older man told Arya they wouldn't turn them out until they could fend for themselves. If rumors were to be believed, the countryside was crawling with bandits and deserters, and Targaryen outriders, though no one seemed sure. War had made the world a chaos. At night, Arya dreamed of the mountain's dying roar. Sometimes she saw the Night King's cold gaze, or the face of Walder Frey. The faces of those she had killed haunted her. Yet in some dreams, she saw her family. Sansa in Winterfell's great hall, Bran beside the weirwood tree, Jon on the battlements. She heard her father's voice, reminding her that she was a Stark. The nightmares didn't vanish, but she found a strange calm creeping in. She had no illusions that her soul was free from blood, but she was alive, and maybe that was enough for now. One morning, she woke to the sound of horses in the yard. Fear jolted her. Were they bandits? Soldiers? She grabbed a small knife from the bedside, ignoring the twinge in her ribs. She limped out to find Sandor already there, leaning heavily on a walking stick, observing with suspicion. The farmer and his daughter stood a few steps away, watching as two men dismounted. These men wore bits of mismatched armor, but no clear sigils. Mercenaries, perhaps. They seemed hungry, dirty, desperate, but not immediately hostile. Arya sidled up beside Sandor, keeping the blade hidden. The men asked for water. The farmer warily agreed. They drank from a ladle, glancing around. One asked if the farmer had any goats. The father said no, they'd lost them in the fires. The men cursed their luck, then rode off, muttering about heading north. When they were gone, Sandor shook his head. Vultures, he spat. This place won't stay safe for long. Arya noticed the farmer's tense posture. He knew it too. If more armed men came, they might not leave so peacefully. We'll go soon, she said, feeling a pang of guilt. She and Sandor were endangering these good people by staying. That night, she quietly gathered what meager belongings she had, which amounted to a spare tunic and the small knife. She had lost her coin purse in the city, but she still had Jaqen's iron coin. Sandor was rummaging around for a cloak or coat to protect him from the cold. The farmer's daughter, quietly watching, handed him an old cloak. He grunted thanks. Arya turned to the older man. You've given us more kindness than we deserve, she said, voice hushed. We'll repay you one day if we can. He shook his head, eyes tired but kind. Just keep on living, girl. That'll be enough. She bowed her head. Then she and Sandor slipped into the night, making their way carefully to a dirt path that led away from the cottage. The moon hung low, casting pale light over the fields. Arya's ribs ached, and the hound leaned on his stick, limping with each step. They were far from whole, but they were alive and free. They walked in silence for a time, letting the moon guide them. A breeze stirred the tall grass. Eventually, Sandor spoke, his voice gruff. You've done it, you know. You killed the mountain. That was your big name on the list. Arya exhaled, her breath a thin cloud in the night air. He was one of many, she said. But maybe the worst. Sandor inclined his head. The worst. They continued, the path winding through a patch of trees. Arya thought of the many names she had carried in her heart. So many of them were dead now, by her hand or someone else. The list felt strangely empty, and she felt free in a way she never had before. Though the cost of that freedom was heavy. What now? Sandor asked, glancing at her. Arya remembered the fork in the road that lay ahead, one path leading north, one heading west. She thought of Winterfell, of Sansa, of the seat of her ancestors. But she also thought of the unknown lands beyond the sea. I haven't decided, she admitted. What about you? He barked a short laugh. Nay? Didn't think I'd live this long. Might find a quiet corner, if such a thing exists. Or might just keep wandering. He paused, then turned his scarred face to her. You were never meant for a quiet corner, girl. She tilted her head, a wry grin tugging at her lips. Probably not, but a little peace might be nice. They walked on, neither sure of the future. But for tonight, they were alive under the moonlit sky, far from the ruin of King's Landing. Somewhere behind them, the Red Keep smoldered, the mountain's corpse rotted, and a new queen took or lost her throne in a city of ashes. Perhaps the realm would see another day of bloodshed, or perhaps a new dawn of uncertain peace. Arya didn't know. All she knew was that Gregor Clegane, the monstrous shadow that had loomed over her nightmares, was dead, killed by her own hand, and she had survived. She and the Hound had walked away from the darkness, forging a bond that was neither friendship nor enmity, but something like respect between two scarred souls. And so, she placed one foot in front of the other, her breath lingering in the cold air, her mind drifting to the open road ahead. She felt the weight of all she had done, but also the stirring of a strange hope that perhaps, in this shattered world, she could find a place for herself. No longer a girl with a list, but a survivor with a future. The night stretched on, quiet but for the distant rustle of wind in the grass. Arya Stark walked alongside Sandor Clegane, leaving the city of ashes behind them, forging a new path in the uncertain darkness. Whatever lay ahead, she had done what she needed to do. Tomorrow would bring its own trials, but for now they kept walking, hearts still beating, guided by the faint shimmer of distant stars. They walked under the soft shimmer of the faraway stars, two battered souls heading into lands unknown. Clouds skated across the moon's pale face, turning the fields into a shifting tapestry of darkness and faint light. The air was cool and carried the lingering scent of ash, though each step took them farther from the smoldering city. Arya Stark was keenly aware of the ragged sound of their footsteps, of Sandor Clegane's uneven breaths, of the dull throb in her own ribcage that felt worse with every mile. They were still a pitiful pair, one leaning on a makeshift walking stick, the other wincing whenever the road dipped into hollows or rose up in lumps of hardened earth, but neither had voiced a complaint in hours. There was little point in complaining. Life was enough of a gift after all they'd survived. They found the skeleton of an old cart by the roadside, not long after leaving the farmland. Its wheels were missing, the wood warped from exposure. Weeds had grown through the gaps in the cart's frame, as if nature already strove to reclaim what men had abandoned. Sandor slumped against it for a moment, letting out a choked cough as he tried to massage the pain in his side. Arya kept watch, scanning the surroundings for any sign of travelers or bandits. The countryside looked empty, though from her vantage, she could see the faint outline of a larger road in the distance. She guessed it might lead north or curve east along the Blackwater, eventually meeting the roads to Rosby or Duskendale. We could try for the Crownlands Road, she suggested, her voice low. We'll find more farmsteads, maybe an inn. If we keep heading west, there's little but scorched fields. Sandor snorted, adjusting the cloak that the farmer's daughter had given him. An inn means people. People talk. Rumors spread. Might catch up to us that way. Arya studied his face. He was pale, though the lines of pain around his mouth were etched with a certain stubborn determination. "Who's after us now?" she asked, tone resigned. "The Lannisters are in ruin. The mountain is dead. The Targaryens, well, if they're rounding up survivors, they'd as likely kill half the realm before we'd matter. They might kill us for sport if they think we're Lannister men," he said. "Or if someone recognizes me, they'd put me in chains for desertion or for the things I did for Joffrey once upon a time." Arya's lips parted. She thought about that. The realm was in disarray. Who knew what new laws or who new enforcers might be scouring the crownlands now? Daenerys Targaryen had unleashed a storm of fire. Perhaps she would set up patrols, or let the remnants of her unsullied roam the roads. All that was uncertain. Swirling in rumors. "All right," she said, exhaling. "We can try a more remote path. Fewer eyes. But we still need shelter sometimes, and supplies. We'll be careful," he muttered. "Not like we've got another choice." They trudged on, leaving the broken cart behind. A half-mile later, they reached a crude fork in the dirt track. One way seemed to skirt the edges of a narrow wooded area, the other meandered through more open farmland. They paused. Arya glanced at the woods. The twisted shapes of branches in the moonlight reminded her of a haunted forest. But it was cover. The farmland, while easier to navigate, would leave them exposed if soldiers or brigands came riding. She pointed toward the woods. Sandor nodded, leaning heavily on his stick, and so they veered onto that path. The moonlight flickered in and out of the canopy, painting their faces in ghostly silver. Now and then the wind rattled the leaves overhead. Arya felt a flicker of unease, not at the darkness, but at the memories it invoked. Memories of nights spent hiding from Lannister scouts in the Riverlands, of stumbling upon atrocities and cruelty. But maybe the horrors left behind in King's Landing had inured her to gloom. At least out here, in the hush of the trees, the smell of smoke was fading, replaced by the scent of damp earth and old pine. They pressed on through the night, pausing only when Sandor needed to catch his breath, or when Arya's ribs flared so violently that she had to stop. The threat of more war parties weighed on their minds, though the hours slipped by without sight of any other travelers. Eventually, their fatigue became impossible to ignore. Sandor's leg threatened to give out, and Arya's entire body hummed with pain. They found a small clearing near a trickle of a stream, just wide enough to settle down. There was a fallen log that offered a bit of seating. Arya gathered what meager kindling she could, though neither was in any shape for a large fire. The risk of drawing attention was another consideration. In the end, she lit a tiny, smoky fire, enough to keep them from freezing in the chill of the pre-dawn hours. The flame cast dancing shadows on their faces. Sandor leaned back against the trunk of a broad oak, wincing as he shifted. "You sure your side's not going to kill you overnight?" Arya gave a faint smirk. "I'll live." In truth, every breath was tight, but she'd known that feeling for days. She took shallow inhalations, refusing to think about how easily it could become worse if infection set in, or if a rib was pressing dangerously on her lung. But the farmer and his daughter had done what they could, and she was grateful to be alive. She offered Sandor the remains of a piece of bread she'd snagged from the cottage, along with some dried apples. He took them, chewing slowly, not complaining about the stale taste. Arya consumed her portion without relish, but her stomach rumbled for more. It would have to do until they could find better provisions. They slept in turns, though neither truly rested well. Nightmares prowled the edges of Arya's mind. She saw flashes of King's Landing in flames, the mountain's hideous face contorted in that final moment. She dreamed of the Red Keep's collapse, of choking smoke, of hearing her father's voice somewhere beyond the rubble, but never finding him. When she jerked awake, the sky had lightened to a pale gray, the fire reduced to embers. Sandor was awake too, staring at nothing in particular. They rose stiffly, doused the last coals of the fire with dirt, and resumed their journey. The day's first rays filtered through the foliage, revealing a winding path scattered with stones and protruding roots. Now they could see the scratch marks of cartwheels on the ground. This path must be traveled by local farmers sometimes, or maybe hunters. They walked for hours, pausing intermittently to rest. Arya tried to watch for signs of farmland or a hamlet. It felt strange, journeying in near silence with Sandor. Once, she'd been his captive, or so it had seemed. Another time, he'd become something like a guardian, and then they had parted ways under violent terms. Now the world had shifted so drastically that it felt as though all those earlier versions of themselves had existed in a different life. Near midday they emerged from the woods into a gentle slope of meadows, dotted here and there with solitary trees. A small herd of goats grazed on a far hill, watched by a single boy in a tattered cloak. He spotted Arya and Sandor from a distance, stood up in alarm, then whistled. The goats seemed to know the cue. They scattered, and he followed, leading them away from these strangers. Arya couldn't blame him. Two ragged figures skulking out of the forest would have spooked her too if she were in his place. They considered approaching him anyway, to ask for directions or food. But the boy was already well beyond shouting range and hurrying off. Sandor shrugged, leaning on his stick. "We'll find something else." Arya scanned the horizon. "We should keep going," she said. "It's better if we're not chasing frightened children." She took a step, felt the sharp protest of her ribs, and curled an arm around her side. "Might be a settlement further on." Sandor's eyes flicked to her. "We'll rest if you need it." She resisted the urge to snap that she was fine. Instead, she just nodded and forced herself forward. They continued, passing through rolling meadows that smelled of sweet grass and dew dye. Here and there, wildflowers burst in small clusters. It was a jarring contrast to the devastation around King's Landing. Now, under the brightening sun, it seemed like a different world entirely. Peaceful, if one ignored the ache of injuries and the worry of survival. They saw no more signs of habitation for a while, until they crested a low ridge and found themselves looking down at a shallow valley. There, a modest cluster of huts stood beside a winding brook. Arya observed a few people milling about, barely more than silhouettes from this distance. A thin plume of smoke rose from a central hearth. They exchanged a glance. Sandor's face was tense. "We need supplies," he said. Arya nodded. "We go carefully." They descended the slope in a roundabout way, trying not to look like a threat. When the huts came into clearer view, Arya realized it was no more than a small hamlet. A handful of families, perhaps. There were gardens enclosed by rickety fences, a rough pen for pigs, and a single battered horse tethered near a thatched stable. A few children ran around barefoot, chasing each other. At the sight of two strangers approaching, an older woman herding a goose shouted something. Several men and women appeared, some holding tools that could double as weapons: a sickle, a pitchfork, a mallet. Arya raised her hands, trying to appear non-threatening. "We don't want trouble," she called. One of the men, tall and weathered by years in the sun, stepped forward. He had a short, bristly beard and wore a patched tunic. "Who are you?" he asked, voice wary. Sandor said nothing. Arya glanced at him before responding. "Travelers," she replied. "We escaped the fighting in King's Landing. We're wounded and short on food." She paused, meeting the man's hardened gaze. "Do you have anything to spare?" Some in the group muttered among themselves. They looked them up and down, noticing Sandor's bulk and the scars that marred his face, and likely the faint traces of dried blood on his clothes. Arya couldn't blame them for being cautious. Finally, the tall man pointed his sickle at them. "The wars caused a flood of desperates. We've had bandits come through, stealing what little we have. You don't look much better than them." Arya lifted her chin. "I'm from the north. My name is Arya Stark." Saying her own name aloud felt strange, almost foreign. "This is Sandor Clegane. We fought against the dead, and now we're just trying to stay alive ourselves. We'll pay if we can, or work for a meal. We mean no harm to you or your families." Men. Her name, or perhaps her mention of the dead, made them shift uneasily. One woman whispered something, though Arya couldn't catch the words. The tall man narrowed his eyes. "Arya Stark, you say? You've got a northern look, but there's no telling who you truly are in times like these." Sandor's mouth twitched with impatience, but he held his tongue. Maybe he was too tired to bark threats. Arya was grateful for that. She pressed a hand over the ache in her side. "You have no reason to trust me," she said evenly. "All I can give you is my word. If you turn us away, that's your choice." The tall man hesitated. Then the second man, gray-haired and stooped but with keen eyes, stepped forward. "A Stark of Winterfell, you say? We used to hear that name spoken well. Winter came, and the North rose up for the living." The mention of the living war made Arya's heart pinch, recalling that horrible night at Winterfell. She offered a short nod. "We were all on the same side then." The older man studied her for another moment, then sighed. "We have little to spare, truly, but if you'll do some chores we might be able to give you a place to rest for a day or two. We don't want bloodshed." Arya let out a pent-up breath. "We'll work," she said. "Thank you." Sandor said nothing, but she sensed his silent relief. The tall man lowered the sickle, still watching them warily. "We'll let you stay in the old storage hut," he said. "No trouble from you, understand?" Arya gave a curt nod. "Understood." They followed him into the hamlet, noticing the guarded stares from the villagers. Chickens scratched in the dirt. A few scrawny dogs trotted about, sniffing at them warily. It was a simple place, but a living one, not a ruin. Their guide brought them to a small structure at the edge of the hamlet. Half of its roof seemed patched with new thatch, and the wooden walls had chinks of daylight coming through. Inside, the floor was dirt, and a stack of broken crates lined one wall. There was enough space for 2 people to lie down if they didn't mind the cramped quarters. The tall man set his sickle aside. "You can store your things here. We'll give you some water. What you do for us, we'll discuss once you've rested a bit. My name is Darren." Arya inclined her head. "All right." Darren left them to settle in. Arya and Sandor exchanged a glance in the dim, musty space. "Better than sleeping in the mud," she murmured. Sandor grumbled, rubbing his leg. "Barely." But he lowered himself to the ground with a labored sigh, wincing as he did. A short while later, the older man arrived with a ladle of water and a small loaf of tough bread. He introduced himself as Hammer. Said he was the closest thing this hamlet had to a leader besides Darren. They'd known each other since they were boys, apparently. "We'll need to see some work from you," he told Arya. "Fence mending, haul some water from the brook, gather kindling, that sort of thing. Darren's boy went off to war under the Lannister banners, never came back, so we're short on hands." Arya bit into the bread, nearly cracking a tooth, then dipped it in the ladle's water to soften. She nodded. "I'll do what I can." Halmer eyed Sandor. "What about him?" Sandor gave the older man a look. "I'm not good for fence mending," he said flatly, gesturing to his bad leg. "I can try, but you'll get half the work out of me." Halmer pursed his lips. Not quite sympathetic, but not cruel, either. "We'll see if you can split some wood while sitting, or fix up the stable. Least you can do is not lie around all day." Sandor muttered something under his breath, but grudgingly nodded. So began a tense coexistence in the hamlet. The first day, Arya forced her body to do simple chores, carrying small buckets of water from the brook, collecting scattered sticks and branches for fuel, raking the churned-up earth near the pigpen. Her ribs protested constantly, sending daggers of pain through her chest. More than once, her vision swam, and she had to pause to breathe. The villagers noticed but said nothing. Some might have taken it as laziness, though a few kinder ones gave her a look that suggested they understood. Sandor spent the day on a 3-legged stool by the stable, attempting to nail loose boards back into place. He had a short hammer and a small pile of nails that Halmer had provided. She heard the occasional swear drift across the yard when he hit his thumb or had to shift his injured leg. By evening, he had at least managed to patch a corner of the stable wall, though the fit was rough. They were fed a thin stew that night, mostly turnips and scraps of salted pork. Sitting around a small cook fire with the villagers, Arya felt the weight of their suspicions still. They made small talk among themselves, discussing the next planting season, the threat of bandits, the rumors of who sat on the Iron Throne, if there was still an Iron Throne to sit on. No one asked her about King's Landing. She suspected they either didn't want to know the horrors, or they were worried any mention might set these battered strangers off. Still, At least they had a roof over their heads and something warm in their bellies. Before turning in, Arya walked to the edge of the hamlet, gazing at the stars. The faint silhouettes of distant hills stretched black against the horizon, and the wind carried the scent of churned soil. There was a hush here that felt oddly sacred. For all the fear and distrust, these villagers had a kind of peace she had rarely known. In the next days, their routine settled. Arya woke each morning and helped with chores as much as she could. Her ribs slowly improved, though the bruising persisted. Sandor, for his part, grew a bit less surly with each hammered nail or fence repair, though he grumbled about the hamlet's meager rations. Some of the children grew bolder, peeking at them from behind corners. Arya caught them staring at her once, wide-eyed, as if uncertain whether she was some mythical creature. She couldn't blame them. Rumors about the Starks, the dead, the dragons. They must have sounded like stories out of an old mother's tale. One afternoon, while Arya was kneeling to weed a small patch of vegetables, the older woman who herded geese approached. She was stocky and stern, her hair coiled in a tight bun. "Darin said you're a northerner," the woman said, by way of greeting. "Name's Elin." Arya sat back on her heels, brushing dirt from her hands. "That's right." Elin looked her up and down. "Heard you mention Winterfell. My nephew was conscripted by the Boltons a few years back. I'm guessing you know of them." Arya felt a flicker of old rage and sadness. "They betrayed my family. They're all dead now." Elin's expression didn't shift. "So they are. But my nephew never came home. I suppose none of them did." She sighed, glancing at the sky. "War's made orphans and widows of us all. Doesn't seem to end." Arya had no comforting words. She set her jaw. "I'm sorry about your nephew." Elin nodded, as if that was all she expected. Then she knelt, calloused hands sifting through the dirt as she helped with the weeding. Her gestures were brusque, but not unfriendly. For a while, they worked in silence, side by side, pulling up the persistent weeds. Eventually, Elin spoke again, her voice subdued. "Has the city truly fallen? We've had travelers come by saying it was in ruins, that the Dragon Queen was unstoppable." Arya hesitated. She saw in Elin's dark eyes the fear of the unknown, the longing for some shred of truth. "It was destroyed," Arya said softly. "The keeps half collapsed. So many dead." She swallowed, biting a flood of bitter memories. "She burned the city. I don't know what remains of her forces. It was madness." Elin's face hardened. "Then there's no one left to keep order." Arya's silence spoke volumes. Elin let out a soft, humorless laugh. "Guess we'd best look out for ourselves then." That day, none of the villagers asked more about the Targaryens. Arya suspected news would filter through eventually. Perhaps a caravan or a band of ex-soldiers would bring stories. For now, the hamlet clung to its simple life of chores and vigilance. Arya found it surprisingly easy to slip into the quiet rhythms, though she knew it was only temporary. She didn't belong here, not truly. And neither did the hound. Late one afternoon, as she was hauling water from the brook, she spotted Sandor at the edge of the hamlet, staring out across the meadow. She set her buckets down and limped over to him. His expression was troubled, eyes distant. "What's on your mind?" she asked. He gave a small shrug. "Place like this. Farm folk. They don't want us here." "Not really. They fear me. Maybe you too. We'll wear out our welcome." "Ben?" Arya studied his posture, the way he leaned slightly on his walking stick. His leg was healing, but slowly. "We can leave soon if you want." He let out a breath. "Where to?" She shifted her weight, considering the question. "North," she said at last. "I still have family there. Sansa, my sister." "Well, she was at Winterfell the last I heard. Maybe she's queen in the north now, if the rumors are true." He grunted. "The Lady of Winterfell. She was always the fancy one, right?" Arya shot him a look. "She's changed. We all have." "Then now?" Sandor's eyes flicked down. Well, maybe she's changed," he said. "But you think the north wants the hound wandering up to their gates?" Arya crossed her arms, ignoring the faint twinge in her ribs. "I don't care what they want. You helped me survive. You fought for the living. If you want to come, that's your choice. If you don't," she shrugged, "you could wander the countryside until you drop dead of boredom or some infection." He gave a short, humorless laugh. "You've always had a mouth on you." She allowed a tiny smirk. "I've had a good teacher." They fell silent for a moment, watching a hawk circling overhead. Arya felt a tension in her chest that had little to do with broken ribs. She had told herself so many times that she would never settle in Winterfell, that she would roam free, sail west of Westeros, see the ends of the world. But something about seeing the absolute ruin of King's Landing had shifted her perspective. She wanted to see Sansa again, wanted to stand under the ancient weirwood tree and feel something stable beneath her feet. Maybe it was only a fleeting desire, but it called to her nonetheless. "I'll go north," she said quietly. I want to see if my family's still there, if there's anything left worth returning to." She looked at him. "You don't have to, but come if you'd rather not be alone." Sandor's gaze drifted to the horizon. For a moment, he said nothing. Then, he gave a small nod. "All right, girl, the north it is." They decided to depart at dawn the next day, not wanting to linger and test the villagers' patience further. That evening, Arya approached Darin and Halmer, telling them they would be on their way. The men nodded, not hiding their relief. But Halmer, despite his cautious nature, gave her a small bundle of dried fish and turnips for the journey. "You worked," he said. "As promised, we won't send you off empty-handed." Darin said nothing, but his expression was neutral rather than hostile, which Arya took as a small victory. Outside, Ellen silently handed Arya an old water pouch. "You'll need it," she said tersely. When Arya thanked her, the woman gave a curt nod and turned away. That was as close to kindness as this place could risk offering. At dawn they left the storage hut and set off, each carrying meager supplies. Sandor still leaned on his walking stick, but seemed a bit steadier. Arya's ribs felt less like knives with each step. They followed the faint track that led out of the valley, aiming to find a main road farther north. Clouds drifted overhead, and the morning air bore a gentle chill. They walked for hours across rolling hills, occasionally stumbling upon an abandoned farmhouse or an empty barn. The farmland looked as though it had been stripped by soldiers or bandits, doors smashed, fences broken, the fields left to wither. Once, they found a well with surprisingly clear water. Sandor insisted on checking for any sign of poison or a rotting corpse at the bottom, but it seemed safe enough. They drank their fill and refilled the water pouch. Toward midday, they spotted movement in a distant field. A group of figures rummaging around a burned-out farmhouse. Arya crouched behind the remains of a stone wall to watch. There were half a dozen of them, men with mismatched clothing, some pieces of armor from different houses. One carried a spear, another a sword. Their posture was tense and aggressive, their voices loud. She guessed they were deserters or brigands looting the ruins. Sandor moved beside her, staying low. "We'd best go around," he muttered. Arya agreed. She wasn't eager for a fight, not in their condition. They skirted the perimeter of the field, careful not to be seen. Now and then, Arya's heart thudded at the thought of confrontation. She was no stranger to combat, but with her ribs still healing and Sandor's injuries, it could end badly. Luckily, the looters never spotted them. They disappeared behind the farmhouse, and Arya and the Hound continued on. They pressed north for days, or maybe a fortnight. Time became slippery. They made camp wherever they found shelter, under a rocky overhang by a stream, in the loft of a collapsed barn, in a shallow cave on a hillside. Each night, they dozed uneasily. Some nights, they heard distant shouts, or saw flickers of torchlight in the valleys below, presumably more bands of scavengers, or lost soldiers. But none came upon them directly. Along the way, Arya's body continued to mend. She found she could move more freely, though sharp pain still rippled if she twisted wrong. Sandor, too, seemed sturdier, relying less on his walking stick. Sometimes he muttered about heading west instead, maybe to find somewhere truly remote, like the Sunset Sea. But each time, Arya reminded him of the plan to reach the north. For reasons he didn't voice, he never truly objected. Maybe he just didn't want to limp off on his own. They saw more evidence of chaos in the realm. Caravans of refugees trudging along roads with haunted eyes. Riders with no banners galloping past with panic in their voices. Villages half burned. Once, they crossed paths with a Targaryen patrol. 3 men on horseback, wearing black and red cloaks. Arya and Sandor quickly hid in a cluster of tall grasses. The men passed without noticing them, but Arya saw the nervous grip they kept on their reins, as if expecting attack at any moment. Eventually, they reached a well-worn road that snaked northwest. Arya recognized it from old memories as the Gold Road extension that led toward the Crown Lands from the Westerlands, but branching roads from it could guide them north. They decided to follow it a short way until they found a safer route. Though safer was a relative term these days. Late in the afternoon, with the sun beginning its descent, they emerged onto a stretch of road overshadowed by tall poplar trees. Birds twittered in the branches, and the breeze rustled the leaves in a comforting hush. Sandor limped a step behind Arya, scanning both sides for trouble. That was when they heard hooves behind them. Arya's instincts flared. She glanced over her shoulder and saw 2 mounted figures approaching at a brisk trot. "Off the road," she hissed. They slipped among the poplars, pressing their bodies against the rough bark, hoping the foliage would hide them. Arya peered through the leaves, her heart pounding. If these riders were just travelers, fine. If they were bandits or Targaryen scouts, better to avoid them. As the riders drew closer, Arya glimpsed their attire. One wore a dark cloak pinned with a tarnished sigil she didn't recognize. The other wore a simpler garb of leather, though a sword dangled at his hip. They looked travel-worn and dusty. They paused on the road near where Arya and Sandor had been standing, scanning the roadside. "You see them?" the first rider asked, a woman's voice, low and controlled. Arya stiffened. Had they been spotted? She resisted the urge to crouch lower. From the corner of her eye, she saw Sandor's hand drift to the hilt of a short knife he carried. The second rider, a younger man, shook his head. "Tracks lead here, but they vanish. Might be they ran off." He glanced at his companion. "Do we bother?" The woman swore under her breath. "We're paid to find them. My guess is they slipped into the trees." She turned her horse, scanning the line of poplars. "Oi!" she called. "We've no quarrel if you're common folk. But if you're the bastards who stole from our camp, you'd best come out." Arya's mind raced. They'd stolen nothing, obviously. But these 2 might not believe them. Slowly, she motioned for Sandor to stay still. However, Sandor Clegane had never been known for patience. He was battered, yes, but also a man done with hiding. With a low growl, he stepped out of the trees, raising both hands to show he held no weapon. Well, not in hand at least. Arya cursed under her breath and followed. "Who are you calling bastards?" Sandor barked, voice echoing under the poplars. The woman on the horse tensed, gripping her reins. She had sharp features and a line of scars on her right cheek. Her hair pulled back in a tight braid. The younger man beside her looked startled at Sandor's size and the ugliness of his scars, but he didn't draw his sword yet. "You made a poor choice stepping onto the road, friend," the woman said, though there was uncertainty in her tone. "We're looking for a pair of thieves who took off with our supplies." She glanced at Arya, noting her slender build and dusty clothes. "You 2 traveling alone?" Arya stepped forward, drawing herself up. "We didn't steal anything," she said firmly. "We've just come from the south." The younger man peered closer, noticing the dark matted stains on Sandor's garments. "Fled from King's Landing?" Sandor let out a harsh laugh. "What's left of it?" The woman's eyes narrowed, scanning them for weapons. She noted Arya's posture. "You armed?" "Yes," Arya said flatly. "But we've no quarrel with you. If you're here for bandits, you've got the wrong pair." They looked at each other. The younger man shrugged. "Could be telling the truth." The woman exhaled. "Fair enough. We tracked footprints and thought you might be the ones who robbed us last night. If not, then I've got no business with you." Arya felt a flicker of relief. "Then we'll be on our way." She took a step, intending to circle around them, but the woman's gaze lingered on her face. Wait. Her brow furrowed. You're not just any traveler. I recognize you, or near enough. Those eyes in that face, you were the wolf girl, Arya Stark. Arya's pulse quickened. She was surprised. I am, she said slowly, hand flexing near the hilt of a dagger. How do you know my name? The woman dismounted, albeit carefully, as if not to startle them. She held her reins loosely. I fought at Winterfell. Not at the great battle, but I arrived a week after, with a band of sellswords from the Vale. The stories of Arya Stark were told around the fires. The girl who slew the Night King. Her voice was calmer now, tinged with a certain respect. Name's Meliana. This is Corin. We were traveling south to see if there was coin to be made, but we got ourselves robbed outside a tavern. Lost half our supplies. Arya eased her stance, feeling a pang of old memory at the mention of the Night King. She gave a stiff nod. I'm sorry about your supplies. But you've got the wrong thieves. Menshao. Meliana pursed her lips. Yes, I can see that now. You've the look of someone who's seen real war. Hard to fake that. She glanced at Sandor. And you? I might not know your face, but there's a rumor that the hound stood with the living against the dead. Might that be you? Sandor narrowed his eyes. It might. Don't see how it's your business. Meliana shrugged. No business at all. Just confirming the stories. She paused, taking them both in. Are you heading north? To Winterfell? Arya exchanged a look with Sandor. Yes, she said. We are. Meliana considered. We're heading that way ourselves, if only to escape the chaos in the south. Maybe find a new contract. There's power in traveling in a larger group. Less chance of being robbed by brigands or worse. Arya measured the sellsword with a careful gaze. She didn't sense malice, only the wariness of someone who lived by the sword. Traveling together might indeed deter casual bandits. But was it wise to trust them? She saw Sandor's lips quirk, no doubt wrestling with the same question. How do we know you won't slit our throats in the night? Arya asked, blunt. Meliana gave a short laugh. You don't. But likewise, how do I know you won't do the same? I suppose we rely on the fact that we've both fought for the living once. On different fronts maybe, but on the same side. She paused. And I'd wager the wolf girl and the hound are formidable foes to any bandits we might face. Corin, the younger man, spoke up. We could share our campsite. We haven't got a lot of supplies, but 4 can gather more than 2. Safer that way. Sandor let out a low rumble in his throat, but he glanced at Arya with a grudging nod. It was true. 2 more swords were 2 more watchers at night. They were all battered by war, but cunning enough to sense advantage in numbers. Finally, Arya gave a small nod. All right, she said. We'll try it. Temporarily. Meliana smiled, though it was a guarded expression. Fair. We'll be traveling up the Gold Road for another day or so, then turning northeast. We can part ways if it doesn't suit you. They mounted up. Meliana climbed back onto her horse, while Corin remained astride his. Arya and Sandor walked alongside them, letting the horses set an easy pace. They made an odd group, 2 sellswords in mismatched armor, and 2 battered survivors from the ashes of King's Landing. But the conversation was minimal, mostly small talk about the roads ahead, the ruin left behind in the Riverlands, the rumor that Daenerys Targaryen's forces had begun occupying Harrenhal. Arya remembered that castle well, one of her worst nightmares. She hoped never to set foot there again. That night, they found a sheltered nook under a rocky outcrop near a stream. Meliana and Corin pitched a threadbare tent, while Arya and Sandor made a small fire. They shared what provisions they had: dried turnips, salted fish, a bit of hard cheese. Corin produced a small flask of something that might have been cheap ale. It tasted awful, but it helped wash down the dryness of the meal. Arya noticed Meliana's gaze flick to her occasionally, curiosity lingering. Eventually, Meliana spoke, voice quiet in the darkness. So, you're really Arya Stark. You killed the Night King. Arya poked at the fire with a stick. I did. Meliana exhaled. The rest of us arrived at Winterfell too late to face him. Heard the stories, though. The Northerners told them around every campfire, half proud, half awed. Some even said you had the face of death itself. Them? Arya's stomach twisted a bit. The worshipful tone that some used to speak of her made her uncomfortable. She remembered the terror of that night, the stench of whites piling against the walls. She remembered the near hopelessness. I was in the right place at the right time, she said softly. Meliana studied her. Strange how the tides of war shift, isn't it? Not a few months after you save the realm from the dead, the realm tears itself apart again with dragons. N.T. Arya's jaw tightened. It's always something, isn't it? She flicked her gaze to Sandor, who stared into the fire. Silent. Sometimes she wondered if they'd ever see a time of lasting peace. Qhorin yawned, stretching his arms. Well, if you can kill the Night King, I'd wager you can handle a few bandits. He gave a slight grin. And if we run into any bigger trouble, that's what the big man's for, yes? Sandor grunted but didn't protest. Arya shook her head at the younger man's easy humor. In the flickering firelight, their small group looked as ragtag as any band of survivors. Patched clothes, travel-worn faces, old scars. They were a reflection of what the realm had become. They established a watch rotation. Arya volunteered for the second watch, a couple hours after midnight. She dozed until Meliana gently shook her shoulder. The sellsword nodded, indicating it was her turn. Arya rose, groggy, and took a position near the edge of the campsite, scanning the dark. The moon was a thin crescent, stars dotting the sky. She listened to the night's hush, a soft breeze rustling the grass, the distant call of an owl. In the gloom, she saw Sandor shift, half awake, perhaps out of old instinct from years of sleeping lightly. She caught the ghostly outline of his burned face, the lines etched in shadows. She wondered if they were doing the right thing. Heading north, seeking Winterfell, did the North truly hold any answers for her? Was her sister truly in command, or had something else happened? Rumors traveled so slowly, twisted in so many ways. Maybe Sansa was still there, forging alliances in the aftermath of war. Maybe she had married again. Maybe Winterfell was thriving, or maybe it was as haunted as Arya's nightmares. And what of Jon or Bran? The last she knew, Jon and Daenerys had marched south to fight the final battles. She'd heard no news since the city's downfall beyond scattered rumors that the Queen was triumphant. But then again, the city she burned had left her rule stained in blood. The hours passed, and dawn approached. Qhorin took the last watch. Arya dozed briefly again before the group stirred with the first glow of morning. They ate stale bread, sipped from the stream, and continued on the road. They fell into a pattern. Each day, they traveled until late afternoon, scanning for a safe campsite. Sometimes they passed other travelers, keeping their distance. Now and then, Meliana and Qhorin asked for details about King's Landing, but Arya answered only in clipped phrases. Sandor rarely spoke unless he had to. On the third day of traveling together, they approached a small crossroad near a disused mill. Smoke curled from a chimney, suggesting someone lived there. Qhorin insisted on investigating, hoping to trade for some better food, maybe some ale. Meliana agreed, but told Arya and Sandor to keep watch. If there were bandits within, a direct approach could be dangerous. Arya hung back with Sandor under the shade of a tree, while the sellswords rode forward to the mill. They watched as Qhorin dismounted and knocked on the door. A moment later, a bearded man stepped out, holding a crossbow. There was a tense exchange at first, but then the man seemed to relax. He lowered his weapon. Qhorin gestured, and after a bit more discussion, the bearded man nodded. He went back inside, presumably to fetch something. Meliana glanced back at Arya and the Hound, waving them closer. Arya approached cautiously, leading Sandor along. By the time they arrived, the bearded man had come out again with a small crate of apples and a jug of what smelled like watery ale. "It's all I've got to spare," he said gruffly, eyes darting between them. "You lot better not be trouble." Sandor grunted. "We're not. We'll pay." Qhorin fished a few coins from a pouch. They looked to be coppers, maybe the last bits of legitimate currency he had. The bearded man gave a tight nod, then spat on the ground. Word is, the realm's gone to the dogs. Nothing but roving killers and dragon lovers. You best be careful if you're heading north. Heard the new queen's men are rounding up any who might be loyal to the Lannisters. Arya kept her expression neutral. We're no friends of the Lannisters. The man shrugged. Don't matter if it's true or not, does it? They see you in battered armor. Might think otherwise. Or they might kill you just for the sport of it. Soldiers get bored. None. Sandor's lip curled, but he said nothing. The man shoved the crate of apples forward, then retreated inside with his crossbow. Meliana placed the apples in her saddlebag, handing a few out for everyone. Arya bit into one hungrily. It was small and soft, but the burst of sweetness was welcome after days of stale rations. They moved on, following the road a short distance before veering onto a track that angled northeast. Arya guessed it would eventually link up with the King's Road or some branch of it. She remembered that tall, ancient highway from the days when she'd traveled south to King's Landing with her father. So long ago it felt like another lifetime. Near dusk, the sky opened up with a sudden drizzle, turning the dirt track into slick mud. They trudged on, cloaks pulled tight, seeking some sort of shelter. Finally, Corin spotted a dilapidated watchtower on a low rise. It looked deserted, half overgrown with moss, but it might offer a roof overhead. They approached cautiously, scanning for any sign of occupation. The entrance was half blocked with debris, but Sandor managed to shove it aside. Inside it smelled of mildew and rodent droppings, but the stone walls were intact enough to keep out the rain. They tied the horses in a sheltered corner, lit a small fire from scraps of old timber, and settled in for the evening. The drizzle became a steady rainfall outside, pattering on the watchtower's remnants of roof. Arya leaned against a cold stone wall, arms folded, as Meliana and Corin rummaged in their packs for some leftover dried meats. Sandor stretched out his leg with a grunt. I'll take first watch, Meliana offered. I'm not fond of sleeping while the wind howls. Arya nodded. She watched the dancing flames of their fire, feeling a curious mix of resignation and restlessness. She couldn't deny that traveling with company did lighten the burden. Yet part of her missed the lonely freedom she once had. Maybe it was the knowledge that in a group, one must be prepared for betrayals or forced trust. She wondered if all the sellswords talk about heading to Winterfell would actually happen. People change their minds at a whim. While the wind drummed against the tower, Sandor closed his eyes. Corin dozed as well, leaving Arya to stare into the flickering shadows. She felt the subtle aches in her ribs, the dull reminder of what she'd survived in King's Landing. She tried not to conjure images of the mountain's final moments, but sometimes they stole into her consciousness unbidden. In a quiet, absent corner of her mind, she felt relief that he was gone. One last monstrous name crossed off her list. But had it truly brought her peace? Her dreams said otherwise. She must have fallen asleep at some point, because the next thing she knew, Meliana was gently shaking her shoulder. Your turn? The sellsword murmured. Arya sat up, rubbing her eyes. The fire was low, mere embers. Rain still hissed outside. She stood, grabbing her cloak, and moved to a gap in the tower's wall that overlooked the road. The night was black, the clouds blotting out the stars. She heard only the drip of rain through the cracks, the rustle of wet leaves outside. She tried to be vigilant, but her thoughts drifted. She wondered about Sansa, or Bran, if he was still at Winterfell. She wondered about Jon Snow, who might be in the city or beyond it, dealing with the aftermath of Daenerys' conquest. Everything felt so uncertain. She remembered the warmth of Winterfell's halls, the quiet strength of its walls, the glow of the hearths in the great hall. It was never perfect. There was always tension, or the chill of the northern winds, but it was home, in some sense of the word. Would it still feel like home now? Or was she forever changed? Shaped by war and vengeance, unable to belong anywhere. When dawn broke, a faint gray light filtered through the cracks of the tower. The rain had eased to a drizzle. They ate a meager breakfast of leftover apples and bread. Sandor grumbled that he wanted something with more bite. Corin yawned and teased him about being a big dog who needed his bones. Sandor shot him a withering glare, but Corin only laughed. They resumed their journey, heading northeast. The road was quagmired with mud. Slowing the horses, Meliana rode in front, scanning for any sign of other travelers. Arya walked beside Corin's horse, while Sandor trudged behind, occasionally leaning on his stick. Every so often, Corin tried to engage them in conversation. Where they came from, what battles they'd seen, who they'd lost. Arya answered in vague phrases. Sandor mostly grunted. Meliana was quiet too, either uninterested or simply private. Around midday, they spotted a small settlement by the road. A cluster of huts with a sign proclaiming it, Halworth Cross. Smoke rose from several chimneys, and the smell of cooking meat drifted across the muddy fields. Corin perked up at that. "We might find a meal or lodging," he said. "Maybe stables for the horses." Arya and Sandor exchanged glances. Lodging would mean more people, more eyes. But they were tired of sleeping in ruined towers, and a hot meal was tempting. "We can try," Arya said. "But keep your guard up." As they approached, they noticed a rough wooden palisade had been erected around the village's perimeter. A couple of men stood at a makeshift gate, each holding a spear. They eyed the travelers suspiciously, but did not bar their entry. Once inside, it was clear the place was on edge. Men and women moved quickly through the muddy lanes, heads down, and a sense of nervousness seemed to hang in the air. At the village center stood a modest inn, a squat building with a sagging roof. A sign, painted with a stylized hawk, squeaked on rusty hinges. Meliana dismounted, leading her horse to a trough. Arya, Sandor, and Corin followed suit. As soon as they set foot near the inn's door, a portly man in a stained apron emerged. He looked them over, lips pursed. "You want rooms, or just a meal?" he asked, suspicious. Corin gave his best disarming smile. "A meal, some ale if you have it, and maybe a stable for the horses. If you've rooms, we might take those too." He patted the coin pouch at his belt, likely near empty. The innkeeper squinted. "Payment first." Meliana rummaged in her belongings, producing a small silver coin. The innkeeper's eyes glimmered. "All right then," he said. "We'll see about that stable, though I don't promise it's much. And we've got a communal sleeping room. No private quarters. You'll take it or leave it." They agreed, stepping inside. The inn's common room smelled of boiled cabbage, old ale, and damp strawed jiweao. A few tables were occupied by haggard travelers, each hunched over a drink or a bowl of stew. Sandor wrinkled his nose, but said nothing. They found a table by the soot-stained fireplace. Meliana drummed her fingers, waiting for service. A thin serving girl approached. She had large, fearful eyes, and stammered a greeting, then took their order for stew and ale. She hurried off, leaving them to survey the common room. Arya noticed a couple of men by the hearth exchanging glances in their direction, sizing them up. In this lawless time, a new group of armed strangers was always a possible threat, or a possible target. When the stew arrived, it was watery, containing only a few lumps of carrot and a morsel of meat that Arya couldn't quite identify. But it was hot. She ate quickly, ignoring the tang of salt that nearly overpowered the dish. Sandor downed his portion in a few slurps, then frowned at his empty bowl. Corin took more time, sipping his ale with a sigh of relief. Meliana leaned over, lowering her voice so only their group could hear. "We'll keep watch tonight. Places like this can turn dangerous after dark." "Them?" Sandor snorted softly. "Not if they know what's good for them." Arya nodded in agreement. She noticed the men by the hearth hadn't stopped glancing their way. She supposed they presented a curious sight. "Stay wary," she murmured. "If they want trouble, they'll find more than they bargained for." They finished the meal and inquired about the sleeping arrangements. The innkeeper pointed them to a door at the back, leading to a large room where travelers slept side by side on straw pallets. The smell was musty, but it was better than the cold ground outside. Meliana and Corin took one corner, placing their bedrolls near each other. Arya and Sandor settled in along the opposite wall. Several other travelers were already there, an old woman snoring lightly, a peddler with a donkey, a small group of what looked like farmhands. As night fell, the inn's common room filled with murmurings and occasional bursts of raucous laughter. Some kind of dice game started at one table. At another, two men argued in low, angry voices over something stolen. Arya sat near the back wall, arms folded, as Miliana and Corin joined the dice game briefly. Sandor stayed beside her, sipping an ale. He disliked gambling, or perhaps the company. After an hour or so, Miliana returned with a grin that suggested a small winning. Corin sighed, having lost a bit of coin. Arya was about to suggest they turn in when the inn's door banged open. A gust of cold air swept in, along with three newcomers. Rough-looking men wearing bits of mismatched armor. They reeked of sweat and stale ale. The man in the lead wore a patched cloak that might once have borne the Lannister sigil, but it was so frayed and muddy that it was impossible to tell. He had a sword slung at his hip, which he tapped with an air of arrogance. The chatter in the inn dulled as these men scanned the room, sneers on their faces. Arya felt her hackles rise. She noticed the serving girl freeze, eyes going wide in fear. The newcomers strode to the hearth, ignoring everyone else, and demanded ale from the innkeeper in a harsh tone. The innkeeper hurried over, wringing his hands. Sandor's expression darkened. "Great," he muttered. "Another bunch of idiots." Corin and Miliana exchanged meaningful glances. Arya tensed, recalling the conversation about thieves or bandits. The men at the hearth coughed out a laugh, ignoring the hush around them. One of them tossed a coin on the ground and barked at the innkeeper to bring a better cask. Miliana leaned into Arya, voice low. "Let's hope they stay interested in their drink." For a while, they did. The tension in the room simmered, but no immediate violence broke out. The bandits, if that's what they were, drank heavily, occasionally making lewd remarks to the serving girl or shouting at the innkeeper. One bragged about killing some sorry scum on the road, though he didn't specify who. Arya felt a surge of anger, but forced herself to remain still. She couldn't go killing every miserable cur who bragged about murder. That was a life she was trying to leave behind, or at least moderate. She nudged Sandor, and they retreated toward the hallway leading to the sleeping room. Miliana and Corin followed. They exchanged a silent understanding. Avoid conflict if possible. The four of them slipped into the communal room, some others having already bedded down. The candlelight flickered on the walls, revealing tired faces and lumps of straw. Sandor lay down on his pallet with a grunt, the floor creaking beneath him. Arya set a hand on the dagger at her belt, resting it near. If those louts from the common room decided to cause trouble, she didn't want to be caught unprepared. Miliana and Corin quietly did the same, placing their weapons within reach. In the dim hush, Arya closed her eyes, listening to the faint murmur of voices from beyond the door. She tried to will herself into sleep, but her thoughts churned with the unpredictability of the times. Any moment, chaos could erupt. She felt the old readiness thrumming in her veins, the same readiness she'd honed in Bravos, in the war against the dead, in the corridors of the Red Keep. Somewhere past midnight, she jerked awake. Footsteps sounded outside the sleeping room, a clumsy shuffle, accompanied by a drunken guffaw. Arya's senses went taut. Sandor raised his head, alert. Miliana and Corin also stirred, quietly gripping weapons. The door creaked open a crack, letting in a wedge of torchlight. "Which bed, you think?" came a slurred voice. "I heard there's a real fancy lady in here. Might be worth a bit of fun." Arya's blood ran cold. She flicked a glance at Miliana, who looked equally furious. Corin shifted, about to stand. Sandor's lip curled in a silent snarl. The door swung wider, revealing one of the rough men from earlier, swaying on his feet, a half-empty mug in his hand. He peered around the room, his eyes blurred by drink. When he spotted Arya and Miliana, something in his expression turned predatory. Then he noticed Sandor rising, a menacing silhouette in the dim light, scars half hidden by shadow. The man hesitated, confusion flickering across his face. "What the?" Arya stood, dagger in hand. Miliana did the same, stepping forward with a cold glare. The man cursed, stumbling backward. "Hey, no need for that," he slurred. "Just having a look." Sandor towered behind Arya, shoulders tense. "Get out," he growled, voice low and lethal, "before I cut your cock off and feed it to your friend." The man's eyes widened at the threat. Even in his drunken state, he must have recognized the danger. He cursed again and turned, nearly tripping over the threshold as he beat a hasty retreat. Arya moved to the door, pushing it shut. She heard some muffled cursing, then footfalls retreating toward the common room. A tremor of fury still coiled in her gut. She looked at the others. Meliana's face was tight with anger, Corin's with disgust. A few of the other sleepers stirred, but none rose. They were likely terrified or too exhausted to intervene. "We should leave," Corin murmured. "They come back with their friends? There'll be a fight." Sandor's jaw clenched. "Let them come," he said. "But maybe we slip out. Less trouble that way." Meliana nodded, already gathering her bedroll. Arya exhaled, tension thrumming in her veins. She didn't want to brawl. She just wanted to keep traveling north. She stuffed her few belongings into a small sack, and the four of them crept out into the corridor. The common room still echoed with boisterous chatter from the drunken bandits. The innkeeper was nowhere to be seen, probably asleep in his own quarters. They slipped past the common room unnoticed, stepping into the muddy courtyard behind the inn. The drizzle had resumed, turning the ground slick. They retrieved the horses from the stable. Corin cursed under his breath as he tried to keep them quiet. The animals snorted but let themselves be led out. Just as they were heading toward the palisade gate, which had been left unguarded in the rain, a figure stepped out from behind a stack of barrels. It was one of the bandits from the common room, presumably relieving himself. He froze at the sight of them leading horses, swords glinting in the faint torchlight from the inn's back window. "Oi!" he shouted, fumbling for a weapon. "What are you?" He never finished the question. Sandor lunged forward, swinging the blunt end of his walking stick into the man's head. The bandit collapsed in the mud with a thud, half unconscious. Arya bit her lip, expecting a further outcry. But the rain muffled sounds, and the man's companions were either too drunk or too far away to notice. "Go." Almumini. Dowd. They hurried to the gate, pushing it open with effort. The wet wood creaked loudly, but by the time any alarm might be raised, they were already heading down the muddy path out of Hallworth Cross. Thunder rumbled in the distance, and lightning flashed, momentarily illuminating the fields. They pressed onward, finding the main road. The downpour increased, soaking cloaks and turning the earth into slippery muck. But none of them slowed. The tension of the inn overshadowed everything else. Finally, after putting a good distance between them and the settlement, they paused under a scraggly oak that offered meager shelter from the rain. Corin panted, water dripping from his hair. "Bloody hell," he muttered. "That's what I get for wanting a warm bed." Meliana shook her head. "A warm bed is a luxury these days," she said grimly. "We'll have to settle for a dry one if we're lucky." Sandor spat on the ground. "Lucky we didn't have to kill them all. But if they'd forced it..." Arya wiped rain from her face, recalling the look in that drunken man's eyes when he suggested fun. Her anger still simmered, but at least they were away. She leaned against the oak, catching her breath. "We keep going north. The further we get from these lands, the better." Meliana and Corin nodded in unison. There was nowhere else to go. The night wore on as they trudged along the road, the horses slogging through mud. Eventually, the storm broke into gentler rain, and the horizon to the east began to lighten. None of them had truly slept, but none suggested stopping. The risk of the bandits pursuing them, if they even bothered, was too high. By midday, the clouds began to thin, revealing patches of pale sky. They found a small stream to water the horses and refill their flasks. The world felt washed clean by the rain, but the gloom of conflict still weighed on Arya's mind. She couldn't help thinking it was a microcosm of what was happening everywhere in the realm. Power vacuums, roving thugs, frightened villagers cowering behind flimsy walls. We should rest, Corin finally said, voice hoarse from fatigue. Just an hour or two, if we can find a dry spot. Meliana grimaced. You're not wrong. We'll be no good to anyone if we drop from exhaustion. Arya scanned the land ahead. The road skirted a gentle rise of land, with rocks and small copses of trees. She pointed to a cluster of boulders near a slope, where the ground might be drier. We can try over there. They led the horses off the track, stepping carefully around muddy patches. The boulders indeed provided some cover from the wind. The ground was stony, but less waterlogged. Meliana tied the horses to a slender tree, then rummaged for some rations. They all sank onto the stones, their cloaks still sodden. Corin nearly collapsed, letting out a weary groan. Sandor tugged at his wet cloak with a scowl. We're going to reek of damp wool for days. Arya managed a faint smirk. Better than reeking of blood. He gave her a sideways glance. Maybe. Meliana doled out bread, and the last of the cheese. It was meager, but enough to keep them going. They ate in silence, listening to the breeze rustling the grass. After a few minutes, Corin drifted into a light sleep, his back against a rock. Meliana followed suit, leaning her head on her saddlebag. Sandor wrapped himself in his cloak, eyes half-lidded. Arya sat with her dagger across her lap, scanning the distance. She thought she might sleep eventually, but for now, her mind refused to settle. She gazed north, imagining the road that stretched onward for countless miles, until it reached the neck, and beyond that, the wide expanse of the north. She wondered if the snows had already begun to return, if the long winter that had threatened was now easing after the defeat of the dead. The seasons in Westeros were fickle. Perhaps the cold lingered. Perhaps Sansa would be in Winterfell, commanding loyal bannermen. Maybe the Umbers and Karstarks were still rebuilding. Arya had tried to remain aloof, telling herself for years that home was just a memory, that she belonged to no one. But some part of her, battered and heartsore, longed to see her sister again, longed for a place that might embrace her without question, though she doubted such a place truly existed. She looked over at Sandor, who had dozed off with his arms crossed, the faint lines of pain still etched into his face. The memory of how they survived King's Landing flickered through her mind. The rubble, the dust, the stench of death, and the monstrous form of Gregor Clegane falling to her dagger. She had never imagined she would be the one to kill the mountain, not after all her time traveling with Sandor, listening to his private vow of vengeance. But fate was a twisted thing. He was free now, at least from that nightmare of a brother. Arya wondered if it had given Sandor any sense of relief. Or perhaps it weighed on him in a way neither of them could name. She understood how vengeance could be hollow. When she killed the mountain, she felt no triumphant surge, only a savage necessity. The fight was brutal, terrifying, and once the abomination lay still, the rest of the world's horrors remained. A restless breeze tugged at her hair, and Arya sighed, letting the tension seep from her shoulders. She told herself that the North might bring a different kind of battle, or maybe some fragile hope of healing. She didn't know. All she knew was the next step, and then the next. That had always been her way. One foot after the other, or one target after the other, until her list was exhausted, until she found a reason to stop. She leaned back against the stone, letting her eyelids droop, the dagger still in hand. The sun peeked through gaps in the clouds, offering a mild warmth. She thought of Winterfell's ancient halls, of the weirwood trees' red leaves, of Sansa's face. Perhaps that was enough to anchor her. Tomorrow would come, and they would continue onward, forging through the broken realm until the North rose before them, cold and unyielding. For now, she would rest. A wolf among strangers, a battered traveler with a past weighed by blood. And in the hush of that rain-washed afternoon, with Sandor Clegane close by, and two Sellswords dozing near their horses, Arya Stark allowed herself a sliver of peace, letting the wind whisper through the grass and the memory of home guide her dreams northward. And they broke camp after a couple hours, rousing themselves from the half-sleep that gave only minimal relief. Corin stretched his arms, complaining of a crick in his neck, while Meliana rolled her shoulders. Sandor grunted as he rose, testing his leg. Arya took the lead, guiding them back to the road. The clouds had begun to clear, revealing strips of pale blue sky, and the sun's wan light gave them a semblance of renewed energy. The next days unfolded in a similar pattern. Long hours of travel, searching for places to camp that weren't overrun by bandits or soaked with rain. They passed more war-torn hamlets, some entirely empty, others boarded up by frightened peasants. Rumors of roving Targaryen patrols reached their ears. Once or twice, they spied black and red banners on the horizon, but avoided direct contact. Arya worried that being recognized as a Stark might complicate matters. She had no idea how Daenerys' new regime regarded the North. The North had bent the knee, but Jon had once been king. Alliances shifted faster than she could keep track. Meliana often inquired about what lay ahead in the North, as she'd never ventured beyond the Twins. Arya gave curt answers: a colder climate, scattered holdfasts, lords who valued loyalty but took kindly to no nonsense. Qhorin seemed excited by the prospect, imagining new sellsword contracts. Sandor mostly kept silent, though occasionally he muttered that the North was full of wind and ice. Better than a city in ruins, Arya would retort. One afternoon the terrain began to shift, becoming hillier, with pine forests dotting the slopes. The temperature felt cooler. They were getting closer to the neck, that marshy stretch that separated the North from the Southlands. The King's Road was said to run through there, though the swamps could be treacherous if one strayed from the path. Arya recalled traveling that route with her father many years ago, the labyrinth of bogs and causeways. She wasn't exactly keen to see it again, but it was the fastest way north. After a long day of crossing these hills, they came upon an old stone inn nestled by a small lake. Smoke curled from its chimney, and it seemed relatively intact compared to the battered establishments they'd encountered before. A half-rotted sign swung on an iron bracket, depicting a fish. The words, "Trout's Rest," were barely visible under the grime. They halted a short distance away, surveying it. "Looks better than some of the places we've seen," Meliana noted. Qhorin grinned. "Maybe we can get a hot bath for once." Arya shrugged. "Let's go carefully. No sense stumbling into trouble." Sandor arched an eyebrow. "We always do anyway." They approached, finding an older woman sweeping the front steps. She paused at their arrival, sizing them up. Arya offered a polite greeting, explaining they sought rooms and food. The woman nodded warily and gestured them inside. A stable hand came around the corner to take the horses. He was a thin boy, no older than 12, who eyed Sandor with open apprehension. Inside, the inn's common area had a few tables occupied by travelers or locals. It smelled of stewed onions and roasting game. The hearth crackled with a decent fire, and the place was lit by lanterns rather than just smoky torches. The innkeeper, a bearded man with broad shoulders, greeted them with a practiced courtesy. They paid in what little coin Meliana had left, supplemented by some trade items, an extra knife blade, a small length of good rope. The innkeeper regarded this with a nod, seemingly accustomed to barter. He directed them to 2 small rooms upstairs, each with 2 cots. 4 cots in total, if that suits you. I've only got these 2 left. Arya and Meliana took one room, Sandor and Qhorin took the other. Arya welcomed the prospect of a real bed, even if only a cot with thin blankets. After stowing their gear, they returned to the common room to partake of the promised meal. A savory stew of rabbit and carrots, fresh bread, and watered ale. It was the best food they'd had in weeks. Arya ate quickly, savoring the taste of real meat. Sandor tore into his portion with the same eagerness, finishing before any of them. When they'd eaten, they lingered at the table, letting their weary bodies relax by the fire. The crackle and warmth lulled them into a comfortable silence. A couple of other patrons sat across the room, chatting in low voices. A minstrel strummed a battered lute in the corner, softly singing a half-forgotten ballad. It was a scene of odd tranquility. Qhorin yawned, pushing his empty bowl aside. "Might be a decent place to rest a couple of nights," he suggested. Meliana raised an eyebrow at Arya. "You in a rush to keep moving?" Arya considered. Her mind screamed that every day they delayed was another day of uncertain news from the North. Another day the roads might grow more dangerous. But her bones ached for rest, and her side still throbbed if she pushed herself too hard. A short respite might do them all good. She glanced at Sandor, who shrugged. "All right," Arya said, exhaling. "One extra day to rest and mend. Then we move on." They finalized the arrangement with the innkeeper, who seemed happy enough to have paying customers. That evening they climbed the narrow stairs to their rooms, each with a small window letting in the cool night air. Arya and Meliana exchanged a few polite words before each settled onto a cot. Meliana was removing her boots, inspecting a raw blister on her foot. Arya lay back, trying to enjoy the relative comfort. The straw-stuffed cot was hardly luxurious, but it felt like a high-borne bed compared to the damp ground. She breathed in the faint smell of lamp oil and old linens, letting her body relax. For a moment, she imagined she was at some wayside inn years ago, traveling with her father. But that was a different life, a different girl. She closed her eyes, drifting into an uneasy sleep. In the night, she woke from a nightmare. Images of the mountain's gargantuan form twisted by Qyburn's experiments, looming over her as flames rained down from the Red Keep's rafters. She jerked upright, heart hammering, breath ragged. Across the room, Meliana stirred at the noise. "You all right?" she asked, voice groggy. Arya pressed a hand to her chest. "Just a dream," she muttered, swallowing the dryness in her throat. Meliana didn't pry, only nodded and rolled over. Arya rose quietly, stepping to the small window. Outside, the moon hovered high, illuminating the still surface of the lake. The water glowed silver, and she saw the faint outlines of reeds swaying along the shore. The world was quiet, the night's hush broken only by the occasional murmur of the wind. She let out a long, slow breath, reminding herself that the mountain was gone, dead by her hand. The Red Keep was miles behind her. She was safe here, or as safe as one could be in these times. She closed her eyes, resting her forehead against the cold windowsill. For all that she'd learned about facing death, about letting go of fear, she was still human. Her memories weighed heavily, sometimes threatening to suffocate her. She wondered if she'd ever truly be free. Perhaps time, distance, and the quiet of the north would help. Perhaps not. Eventually, she returned to bed, pulling the thin blanket over herself. Sleep returned slowly, and her dreams became less vivid, more a swirl of half-remembered faces. Her father, Sansa, Gendry, Jon, the Hound's scowl, the night sky over Winterfell. Morning arrived with watery sunlight filtering through the window. Arya and Meliana rose, heading downstairs to find the innkeeper and arrange for a small breakfast. They discovered that Qyburn had already woken and gone to the lake's edge. Sandor remained asleep, or so the innkeeper said. Arya stepped outside, greeting the crisp air. The inn perched on a slight rise above the lake, and the path sloped down to the shore. She found Qyburn crouched by the water, washing his face. He turned at her approach, droplets glistening on his chin. "Morning," he said, voice cheerful despite the lingering fatigue on his features. Arya nodded in greeting. She looked out across the placid lake, the sunlight reflecting in patches of gold. Small fish darted near the shallow reeds. A sense of calm hung over the scene, as if war and ruin were distant concepts. "Did you sleep?" she asked. Qyburn shrugged. "Better than on the road, that's for sure. I figured I'd enjoy a bit of peace. These days, it's rare enough." He splashed more water on his face. "Maybe Meliana and I will consider staying around these parts if the roads north prove too difficult." Arya knelt at the water's edge, dipping a hand into the cool shallows. "So you're not fully committed to going north?" He chuckled softly. "We sellswards, Arya. We follow the coin, and sometimes our instincts. If it looks like the north is in no state to hire us, or if the road is too dangerous, we might find a decent holdfast that needs extra blades. Or we might go west, try our luck near Lannisport if the fighting's done. The realm's uncertain, opportunities everywhere." She nodded, not surprised. In truth, she didn't begrudge them their mercenary mindset. They had no personal stake in Winterfell or House Stark. They were traveling together out of convenience and mutual defense. One day, that arrangement would end. Perhaps that was for the best. Arya had grown used to people coming and going in her life. They returned to the inn, where Meliana was chatting with the innkeeper about local rumors. Sandor appeared shortly after, looking surly, but slightly rested. They had a modest breakfast of porridge and bread, then discussed their plans for the day. It was decided they would remain here for another night, letting the horses rest and taking advantage of the inn's relative safety. The morning passed quietly. Arya tended to her gear, cleaning her dagger and mending a loose seam in her trousers. Sandor wandered the courtyard, testing his leg, scowling at the old stable hand's attempts to make conversation. Corin helped the innkeeper chop some firewood in exchange for a better lunch. Meliana sat near the lake, polishing her sword. It was a rare lull in the midst of endless chaos. After midday, Arya decided to walk around the lake's shore, letting her thoughts wander. The breeze off the water carried a pleasant chill, and the reeds rustled softly. She stepped carefully on damp stones near the water's edge, noticing minnows skitter away from her shadow. She felt a pang of nostalgia for simpler times, like the days she'd spent climbing around Winterfell's walls, or exploring the banks of the Trident near Harrenhal. Of course, Harrenhal held a different brand of horror, but she recalled fleeting moments of quiet along the water's edge. Her footsteps took her around a small bend, out of sight of the inn. The banks were muddy here, thick with reeds. She noticed footprints in the muck, a single set, seemingly from a man's boots, possibly a fisherman, or just a traveler seeking privacy. She paid it little mind until she heard a faint, muffled sob. Arya tensed. She followed the sound behind a cluster of reeds, finding herself at a smaller inlet of the lake. There, she saw the inn-serving girl crouched beside the water, shoulders shaking with quiet sobs. She looked up in alarm when Arya approached, her eyes red-rimmed. "Sorry," Arya said softly, stepping back. "I didn't mean to intrude." The girl sniffed, wiping her face on her sleeve. She looked barely older than 16, with pale hair and a fragile build. "It's fine," she mumbled, voice tight. I needed a moment away from the inn." Arya hesitated. She recalled the fear she'd seen in the girl's eyes the night before. Something about the bandits, or the general atmosphere of these times, weighed heavily on her. "Are you all right?" The serving girl let out a shaky breath. "I'm not all right, no. But who is?" She tried to compose herself, glancing at Arya uncertainly. "Why are you here anyway? Aren't you a soldier?" Arya shook her head. "No, I'm just traveling north. The war's complicated." She knelt a short distance away, not wanting to loom. "Did someone hurt you?" The girl's eyes flashed with an old terror. "Not recently. But there were men, a few weeks back, I don't want to speak of it." She swallowed hard. "This place, my father tries to keep it safe, but the realm's full of brutes and killers. We can't turn away paying customers, no matter how cruel they are." Arya felt a surge of empathy. She recalled her own brushes with men who would do harm, the precariousness of being young and unprotected in a violent world. "I'm sorry," she said quietly, wishing she could offer more. The girl managed a watery smile. "It's not your fault, but it's been so hard. Sometimes I just come here to cry, to let myself be weak for a moment. Then I go back and serve ale as if everything's fine." A silence settled. Arya glanced at the water's surface, reflecting the sky like a mirror. She thought of all the injustices she'd witnessed. Men like Polliver, like the Tickler, like Sir Meryn Trant, like the Mountain. So many monstrous faces, and she'd spent years avenging some of them. But the world remained rife with cruelty. She couldn't kill them all. She was just one blade. "Maybe it will get better," Arya offered, not sure if she believed it herself. "A new king or queen. Maybe the realm will stabilize." The girl let out a bitter laugh. "Maybe. Or maybe we'll be trampled underfoot by the next wave of armies." She wiped her tears again, then stood. "I'm sorry, I shouldn't be rude. My name's Helena." Arya rose too. "Arya," she said, leaving off her last name. She wasn't sure if telling the girl she was a Stark of Winterfell would help. "I won't say anything about this if you don't want me to." Helena nodded. "Thank you. I need to get back before father wonders where I am. She hesitated, looking at Arya. You and your companions, thank you for not causing trouble. Most who come are less kind. Arya dipped her head. We're just passing through. Helena offered a weak smile, then turned and hurried back around the bend, leaving Arya alone with the quiet lap of water. The breeze stirred the reeds, and Arya stared at her reflection in the lake. The girl gazing back at her looked tired, older than her years, shaped by too many battles. Yet behind that fatigue, there was a hint of sorrow, of empathy. She remembered how a faceless man should be empty, detached. But she had never fully become no one. She was Arya Stark, with a heart that still beat for the suffering of others, even if she rarely knew how to help them beyond a blade's edge. She lingered there until the sun's angle began to shift, then returned to the inn. The afternoon wore on. Corin and Sandor played a half-hearted game of dice, with Sandor cursing the luck of the roll. Meliana spoke with some local farmers who had come to the inn for a drink, gleaning what news she could about the roads north. Arya found Helena in the kitchen, quietly helping her father with supper. The girl caught Arya's eye and nodded, a moment of understanding passing between them. That evening, the common room was blessedly free of raucous bandits. A few travelers lingered over their meals, then headed to their rooms or out to their camps along the lake. Arya's group gathered at a table near the hearth once more, sharing small talk. For a moment, it almost felt normal, like a group of friends sharing stories and jokes. Corin regaled them with a tale of a drunken fight he'd once witnessed in the Vale, describing how a donkey got involved. Meliana rolled her eyes at his theatrics, though a faint smile tugged at her lips. Sandor snorted. Arya listened, letting the mild banter wash over her, a fleeting reprieve from darker thoughts. Eventually, yawns overtook them. They retired to their rooms, planning to depart in the morning. Corin half joked that he might stay behind if he could strike a bargain with the innkeeper to hire him as a guard, but Meliana scoffed at that. I'm not letting you laze around a lakeside inn while I face the unknown roads alone, she said, and Corin smirked. In Arya's room, she drifted into sleep more easily this time, exhausted yet slightly comforted by the day's calm. The nightmares didn't plague her as fiercely, and she woke at dawn with a measure of renewed energy. Downstairs, the innkeeper greeted them politely, serving hot oatcakes and tea. Sandor was notably in a better mood, satisfied with a full stomach and a decent rest. Corin teased him, calling him almost cheerful, earning a half-hearted growl. Meliana asked the innkeeper about the route to the King's Road, which apparently was a few days' ride farther northeast, branching near a town called Hallowby. They paid for their stay with the last of their coin and a promise to spread word of the Trout's Rest as a safe haven. Arya took a moment to say goodbye to Helena, who offered a small, sad smile. Good luck, the girl said, voice subdued. I hope the north is kinder than here. Thank you, Arya replied. She wanted to say more, to offer some promise of returning, or to vow that she'd fix this broken world, but she knew better. All she managed was a gentle nod before heading out the door. Outside, the stable hand returned their horses and gave them a curt farewell. The morning light was crisp, the sky pale blue streaked with wisps of cloud. They set off along the lakeside path, soon merging with the main trail that snaked away through the hills. Behind them, the Trout's Rest became a speck in the distance, and then vanished from view as they crested a ridge. Once more, the road unfurled before them. Arya rode double with Sandor on one of the horses, Corin and Meliana on the other two. The battered realm spread out, dotted with pockets of farmland and scattered woodlands. Now and then they passed streams or shallow rivers. The land rolled gently toward the neck, though they were still some leagues away. The air smelled cleaner, cooler. Arya noticed the shift in vegetation, the pines becoming more frequent. She felt a kind of anticipation stirring in her, though it was laced with anxiety. Sandor, sitting behind her in the saddle, said little. But now and then, Arya sensed he was scanning the horizon, as if searching for threats. The realm might be calmer here than in the Crownlands, but it was still uncertain. All it would take was one group of raiders, or a band of Targaryen loyalists with suspicion in their hearts. They traveled until dusk, finding no inn or village, so they made camp near a cluster of rocky outcroppings. Corin built a small fire, and Neliana gathered what dry wood she could. Arya and Sandor cleared a spot for the horses, tethering them where they could graze on sparse grass. The night was chilly, the wind moaning over the stones. After a dinner of the last chunk of bread and some dried fish, they settled around the fire. Corin dozed quickly, head lolling forward. Sandor propped himself against a boulder, eyes half closed. Neliana offered to take the first watch. Arya, not quite tired, volunteered for the second. She lay down, pulling her cloak tight, letting the flame's warmth lull her. Sleep claimed her in fits, her mind drifting through half-formed images of Winterfell's great hall, of the House of Black and White, of the halls of the Red Keep. Eventually, Neliana woke her for the second watch. Arya took up a spot by the fire, dagger on her lap. The night sky sparkled with countless stars, the moon a waxing crescent. She breathed in the crisp air, glancing occasionally at Sandor's sleeping form. In the flickering light, the lines of his face looked less fierce, more war, a man haunted by too many ghosts. She wondered if he dreamed of the mountain's final moments, or if he dreamed of other nightmares from his childhood. The hours passed, quiet, but for the wind. Arya's watch ended without incident, and she roused Corin for the last shift. He grumbled, but got up, yawning. She settled back onto her bedroll, drifting into a doze haunted by fleeting memories. Morning arrived, pale and cold. They stoked the fire just enough to warm themselves, ate a few mouthfuls of leftover dried fish, and continued onward. Their journey north felt like an endless repetition of travel, weary stops, and restless nights, but slowly the land changed, and the days passed. Whenever they encountered travelers, tension hung in the air, as if all souls in Westeros expected betrayal at any moment. Yet they managed to avoid violence. The roads were not entirely desolate, though they were nothing like the bustling highways Arya recalled from her childhood. Too many had fled or died. On the fifth day after leaving Trout's Rest, they glimpsed a signpost near a crossroads. Faded letters marked the way to Hallaby, apparently only a half-day's ride east. According to locals they'd briefly spoken with, Hallaby was a modest town with a market, an inn, and a minor lord's keep. Another sign pointed north, likely toward the King's Road. They halted at the crossroads, discussing which route to take. Corin suggested visiting Hallaby for supplies, but Neliana argued that the keep's lord might be demanding taxes or suspicious of armed sellswords. Arya pointed out that they were running low on food. Sandor grumbled that he didn't care, as long as they didn't get roped into local troubles. In the end, they decided to at least stop in Hallaby's market. If it proved hostile, they'd leave quickly. With that plan settled, they turned east. The road widened and grew more traveled, with wheel ruts suggesting trade wagons. That was a sign of some measure of stability. Arya found herself hoping that not every place in the realm was a broken ruin. Perhaps they'd see normal commerce, farmers selling produce, blacksmiths forging tools. Sure enough, as they neared midday, they topped a gentle rise and saw the town laid out in a shallow valley below. A wooden palisade surrounded a cluster of buildings, houses, shops, and a small keep on a mound. Smoke rose from multiple chimneys, indicating life. Fields sprawled beyond the walls, dotted with farmsteads. It looked far from prosperous, but at least it was intact. They approached the gates. A pair of guards wearing plain gray tunics stood watch, each holding a spear. They eyed the newcomers warily, but did not bar entry. One guard, a middle-aged fellow, stepped forward. "State your business." Neliana gave a neutral smile. "Travelers seeking to buy supplies, nothing more." The guard looked them up and down, noting the swords, the battered armor. "No trouble, or we'll haul you before Lord Hallaby." Sandor smirked. "We'll be on our best behavior." They passed through. Inside, a handful of narrow lanes led to a central market square, where a few stalls sold vegetables, dried meats, and simple crafts. The smell of a stable mingled with cooking scents. Townsfolk bustled about, some looking curious, others ignoring them entirely. A blacksmith's hammer rang from a nearby smithy, metal on metal. Corin and Neliana guided the horses to a stable yard, paying a small fee to a bored stableboy. Arya and Sandor followed, feeling a slight easing of tension at the sight of everyday commerce. They walked through the market stalls, comparing prices. The cost of food was high, no doubt due to the war's disruption. Arya parted with what little she had left. A small trinket from her belt pouch that she'd carried since leaving the Riverlands, traded for a couple of loaves of coarse bread and some strips of dried pork. Meliana bartered a spare dagger for a pouch of grain. Corin negotiated for a few onions, complaining about the cost. Sandor mostly loomed, letting the others handle the transactions. A matronly woman at one stall offered them a thick stew if they sat to eat at the small tavern she ran in the adjacent building. The idea of a hot meal appealed. They followed her inside, finding a cramped but relatively clean space with a long table. Arya placed an order of stew with some bread and sat down. As they waited, she looked around. Locals sipped cups of ale or nibbled on bread. A subdued calm reigned. "Better than the last place," Corin said with a grin, referencing the inn with the bandits. Sandor nodded curtly. "Let's hope it stays that way." Their meal arrived, steaming with the aroma of spices. It was mostly cabbage and a few chunks of rabbit, but it tasted warm and filling. Arya ate quickly, mindful of not letting her guard down too much in an unfamiliar town. Meliana, too, kept an eye on the door. Halfway through the meal, the tavern door opened, and a young man in faded finery stepped in with 2 armed guards. He carried himself with an air of authority, scanning the room. The tavern's patrons fell silent, some bowing their heads. Arya tensed. This must be the local lord or his son. He approached the table next to theirs and spoke quietly with a man in a scribe's robes, discussing some matter of taxes. Arya tried not to stare. Yet after a moment, the young man noticed her group, his gaze lingering on their armor and swords. "You travelers?" he asked, stepping closer. "I'm Darren Hallowby. My father's the lord of these lands." Corin answered, wiping his mouth. "Yes, my lord, just passing through. We're heading north." "Then Shah." Lord Darren studied them, arms folded. "I see. Are you sellswords?" Meliana dipped her head. "We've done sellsword work, yes. We're not here to cause trouble." He glanced at Arya, noticing her cloak and the subtle tension in her posture. "So many have passed through of late, fleeing the war or seeking fortune. We can't afford brigands or troublemakers. My father tries to keep the peace in Hallowby." Sandor rolled his shoulders, voice rough. "We'll be gone soon enough. We just needed a hot meal." Darren's eyes narrowed at Sandor's scars, but he didn't comment. Instead, he turned to the guards behind him. "No harm in letting them be, if they behave. Lord Hallowby doesn't turn away trade." Arya offered a short nod of thanks. Darren gave them a final once-over, then returned to his business with the scribe, apparently disinterested in pressing further. Arya felt the tension in her shoulders loosen. She resumed her stew, keeping half an ear on the lordlings' conversation. They spoke of harvest yields, of traveling merchants, of an upcoming levy for the crown. She gleaned that Hallowby was still nominally loyal to the Iron Throne, whoever sat upon it. When they finished their meal and paid, they stepped outside to find the sun lowering in the sky. Corin suggested they see if this tavern offered rooms, but Sandor was wary of staying under a lord's watchful eye. Arya agreed. They decided to gather their supplies and move on, camping outside the town walls. Meliana wasn't thrilled at another night outdoors, but she conceded it was safer than risking local entanglements. They retrieved the horses from the stable, loaded their newly acquired provisions, and rode back through the gate. The guards let them out without fuss. The countryside beyond was quiet, the horizon tinted with the orange glow of late afternoon. They followed a small trail that led away from the palisade, aiming to find a secluded spot for the night. A short distance from the town, they found a small copse of trees near a gently sloping hill. The undergrowth was minimal, and the ground was relatively flat. They decided to make camp there. As Sandor and Corin tethered the horses, Arya and Meliana cleared brush to form a small circle for their fire. With the sun dipping low, the sky streaked with pink and gold, Arya took a moment to stand at the edge of the copse, gazing north. Her breath misted slightly in the cool air. She remembered how, in Bravos, the nights often smelled of salt and fish. Here, it smelled of pine and earth, and of a distant promise that the north was near. Each day, They grew closer. She wondered what they would find when they finally crossed the neck. She wondered if her sister was truly ruling Winterfell, or if Sansa had bent the knee to Daenerys. Perhaps the Hound, once they reached the north, would finally part ways with her. Or perhaps he wouldn't. She exhaled slowly, letting the hush of the evening settle over her. Behind her, she could hear the muffled banter of Corin and Meliana, the clink of metal as Sandor arranged stones for the fire. It struck her that, for all their differences, these traveling companions had kept her company during a difficult stretch of road. She felt an odd, fleeting sense of gratitude, even if it was temporary. Tomorrow, they would press on, edging ever closer to the King's Road and the threshold of the north. Arya placed a hand on her side, feeling the lingering ache there, a reminder of the cost of battles fought. She remembered the images of King's Landing in flames, the monstrous roar of the mountain as he died beneath her dagger. There was no turning back from that history, but maybe, just maybe, there was a path forward that led to something like peace. She turned back to the camp, where the flicker of a newborn fire cast long shadows among the trees. She could see Sandor's broad shoulders as he crouched by the flames, coaxing them higher with bits of tinder. Corin rummaged for the onions, preparing a simple meal. Meliana examined her sword's edge, ensuring it was sharp for whatever lay ahead. Together, they formed a small island of life, in a vast sea of uncertainty. Arya took a step toward them, allowing the faintest smile to flicker on her lips. One more night on the road, one more step closer to Winterfell. Whatever awaited her there, she would face it. She was Arya Stark, and she had learned to endure. She had gazed into the eyes of death and said, "Not today." And so she would keep going, past the nightmares, past the ghosts, onward into the gathering dusk, until the north's chill wind welcomed her home once more.